In today's world, there are entirely too many people searching for evil. But you see, you don't have to look for evil because evil is always looking for you. Sometimes it has difficulty finding you because you are at that time looking for something good. But the moment you turn on that television, the moment you turn on that tablet or cell phone, the moment you get on the internet, evil looks at you and says, "Oh, there you are." You see, right now, there is a war going on. A war between science and religion, a war between the sciences, and a war between religions. There is. But you don't have to partake in that. You do not have to participate. Separate yourself. There are religious fanatics who refute scientific facts, as there are naysayers who refute ancient text. They actually believe that some theories are fact. There are geologists that agree the earth was at one time covered in water, but they can never agree on how or when, and many of them will never admit to a great flood. So in spite of these people who are not scientists, I'm going to discuss this. I am going to discuss the flood and the fallen angels. Let me tell you something. Gradual climate change, which is highly accepted today, by the way, does not make fossils. The animal has to be buried rapidly after death, under sediment and then underwater, because you need that extreme pressure and seal to preserve the corpse for fossilization. And then you ask, well, how long does that take? Oh, millions and billions of years. That's what they say. I say, look, if you're smart enough to count that far back, you should be smart enough to give me an exact number, not some relative date. But that's what they do. You think they're laboratory testing everything? At the majority of these digs, they have to report anything that they find, and as a result, you don't always get to see what they find. You know, they find artifacts such as screws and doorknobs in ancient rock. Archaeologists have recently discovered the imprint of a chariot wheel in a deep mine of the Rostov region of Russia, an ancient sandstone that has said to be over 300 million years old. So either the wheel was around 300 million years ago, or that rock is not 300 million years old. By the way, no one will ever know because they flooded the mine. Now I know what you're thinking, and this is a question that comes up all the time. If men, giants, and dinosaurs all existed in Noah's day, and if they were all killed off by the Great Flood, then how come they haven't found any fossils of men from those days? Oh, but they have. But see, they date those human fossils to be hundreds of thousands of years old. Do you know what they do? They use minerals in the dating of these fossils, and if a particular mineral shows that the human fossil is millions of years old, they say, oh no, that's way too old, let's try another mineral. Then the results show that the human fossil is only a few thousand years old, and then they say, oh no, that's too young. They finally get to a mineral that dates the fossil to be around 100 to 300,000 years old. Then they say, oh, that sounds about right. That's what they do. Now in the Bible, in the books of Joshua and Samuel, there is mention of the book of Jasher, the book of the upright. Now they say that this book was lost, but it would have been a canonical work if it still existed. What? So they're saying that a canonical book was lost? How many other canonical works were lost? Would God allow for these works to just disappear? I'm sorry, but that smells fishy to me. What's interesting is that there is a work of fiction called the Book of Jasher, and in it are also accounts of the Great Flood. And it states that the righteous men who knew God lived out their lives and died before they would have to witness the flood. In other words, the only ones who were around to be killed by the flood were the Nephilim, their monsters, and whatever evil men that were still left lurking around at that time. Remember, folks, more than half the planet is covered in water. How many archaeological teams do you see digging up the bottom of the ocean? What's down there? Ancient cities, ruins. One of the trending topics today is that the fallen angels, the ones that were bound in the earth, may be imprisoned below the ice of Antarctica. Well, Antarctica is just the land of the lost, isn't it? It's got everything. Penguins, dinosaurs, tiny humans, giant humans, pyramids, aliens, and now, the fallen angels? See, I know where this story comes from, and there are people who are trying to find out where these fallen angels were imprisoned. And I say, who gives a crap? Those angels were bound. They've got their own problems. What do these people think? They're just going to one day dig up a hole and discover a bunch of angels chained up underground? Trust me, they're going to find death before they find anything of the sort. The Watchers. What about the 1/3 of the angels that fell with Lucifer? They weren't tied up. They are not bound. And we are talking about what could be thousands of them. Here, walking around the earth. Doomed, of course. And they know that they are doomed. And so they teach people things. They reveal secrets. And everything that was taught to man back in the days of Enoch and Noah have been taught to man again. And it's worse than ever. People say, oh, look at the things we can do. No, look at the things that we've done. We've lost all morality. People today, they look the other way when someone approaches them to teach them about God. They don't want to hear it, because all that interferes with their ability to go out and party, to get drunk and do drugs and have sex with whoever and whatever. It dampens their ability to listen to whatever music they want to listen to and to see whatever movie they want to see. Look, people are entertained by the idea of fallen angels being locked up in Antarctica. I don't know anything about any fallen angels being bound in Antarctica. There were 200, and for all we know, they could be everywhere. I will say this. One of the worst places on the planet to be right now is right along the river Euphrates. Biblical texts state that 4 of the fallen angels were bound underneath the Euphrates River. Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. There is apparently a lot of oil there, which means there was and is a lot of death there. Should it surprise you? It may have been the best place on earth at one time, but you can't imagine the amount of horror stories that come out of this region. The anomalies. I mean, this place is on fire, and you know what happens when you get too close to a fire. Why do you think there are so many people there that want to leave? Can you blame them? Go look. Go look at the Syrian horror stories. Their civil war. The systematic destruction of children. Do you know how many children in Syria go missing or are murdered? Do you know how many child Syrian refugees disappear after supposedly fleeing to areas such as Europe? The numbers, my friends, are insane. Go read up on the Gate of Hell in Turkey. There are places like this around the world. How many of you know of the 14,000 meter deep well in Siberia? A hole that was dug back in the late 1980s. After taking temperature readings of the bottom of this well, they discovered the temperature was an astounding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Not only that, but they sent down audio recording equipment to record the sounds of tectonic plate movement, but instead, they recorded what sounded like human voices screaming in agony. Listen. Interestingly enough, the scientists also reported witnessing a luminous gas rising out of the hole, and out of this cloud appeared a winged humanoid being. Needless to say, half the scientists quit working on the project. The point is, folks, The days of Enoch, the days of Noah, they may just be stories, but they are good representations of how man is living today. These are the events of the past, folks, but somehow we happen to get right back at it. When you look at organizations such as NASA and CERN, they're smashing particles, learning the secrets of the universe. You know that every time CERN has a new experiment, they rewrite science? That is what they do, and they are good at it. But where do you think these geniuses get their ideas?
We've often covered the perplexing finds of giant skeletons, which have been repeatedly reported all over the world. We delved into the rumors and evidence of a considerable conspiracy surrounding the Smithsonian Institute and their cover-up of these remains. However, thankfully, it seems modern technology has made this job virtually impossible, and the evidence which has surfaced over the last few decades has finally been getting the publicity it deserves. For example, curious remains guarded by a humble priest from a small village within Ecuador have finally been allowed to see the light of day, and the true extent to this astounding cover-up is beginning to be revealed. Father Carlos Vaca has protected remains of ancient beings for many decades, and upon examination, it was found that they once belonged to people of over 7 meters in height. Apparently, the remains had been discovered from a site called Changaminas in Ecuador, and curiously, Changaminas translates as God's Cemetery. Although reports have surfaced from within Ecuador for over a century regarding finds of similar scales, this is the first time that such remains have remained within the public domain. The Mystery Park in Interlaken, Switzerland, for example, has held since 2004 a reconstruction of a 7-meter specimen of an apparent human being that would have been just over 7 meters in height that was found within Loja. According to Father Carlos Vaca, the remains which he had successfully safeguarded until a time of his own death were given to him by Father Crespi, a figure who collected a vast array of perplexing, highly controversial, and incredible artifacts, including remnants of a puzzling metal library we have previously covered. Unfortunately, upon the event of Father Crespi's death, his collection was ransacked, replaced with clear forgeries and cheap fakes. However, it seems Father Carlos Vaca may have kept some of these artifacts safe until his own death in 1999, upon which they luckily sank into the archives of the Ecuadorian Museum. Are these remains really that of giant human beings? Just who could they have belonged to? Has there really been a concerted effort to conceal these enormous remains from the world for over a century? If so, the question is, where are all these remains now? His collection also contains strange utensils, minerals, and compounds of magical properties, which according to many authors could explain numerous archaeological mysteries that have not yet been deciphered. Some of the bone fragments were supposedly sent to the Smithsonian Institute for further analysis, the results of which were surprisingly broadcast on a television program in Ecuador led by renowned director Alfonso Espinosa de los Monteros. Could the legends be true and the aptly named City of Giants be named after the real thing? It seems thankfully as time goes on, the truth is slowly being revealed. Thanks for watching, guys, and until next time, take care.
Hey folks, this is going to be a brief video, and I do mean brief, demonstrating that uniformitarianism is false and the flood is true. It's a fact. It's a geologic fact. I'm about to show you some evidence of that. Clear-cut evidence. The flood of Noah is a true geologic historical event. Recently, here's a CNN.com article. Recently, a giant gash opened up in Washington state. The earth just simply split wide open. There's a big crack. And here's the crack. Let me show you some other photographs of it. This is the location of it. Now, what's interesting is when we take a look at the earth where it cracked open. This is the proof of the flood of Noah, and that uniformitarianism is false. You see, here's what's revealed in the earth when the earth cracked open there. You see these? Can you see the layers there? Those are called strata. These are sedimentary strata, and you can see that the movement of water, the horizontal movement of water, has hydrologically sorted the different types of materials as it deposited them. There's an interesting feature about these strata that cover the earth. You can see the clear demarcation between these strata. There's some more. The interesting thing is that These clear, distinct boundaries of these strata are evidence that there's a clear, distinct boundary, a strata there, a strata there, and a strata right on top, that the flood of Noah is a historical geologic fact. Because the current secular theory that's been held to for a long time is called uniformitarianism, and it supposedly explains the topography of the earth, the geomorphology of the earth. The problem is, the uniformitarianist, that is the evolutionist camp, believes that these strata were laid down over vast ages of time. Say, for example, this strata here might have been laid down 10,000 years ago, but this one, way down here, 40 or 100,000 years ago, or a million. And here you can see that water has sorted different types of materials. Look at that. Clear, distinct boundary between these strata. They don't blend going upward from one material to another as one material became less available to the earth and Earth's environment and another became more available. Do you see how clear that distinct boundary is between each of these? Look how fine those strata are and the boundary between them. Now see, if these materials were laid down by over vast geologic age, as the uniformitarianist claims, as one material became less available to the Earth's environment and another became more available, these materials would gradiate slowly. You would see a blending of this one into that one over going up through the strata. But we don't see that throughout the Earth. Virtually all the strata have clear, distinct boundaries, like these numerous strata right there. Look how finely the boundaries are between them. Oops, I'm not going to be able to look at them at that magnification, it seems, and not in that photograph. Let's try again. No, it won't let me. So anyway, these clear, distinct boundaries, there we are. Do you see how finely marked these boundaries are? Let's zoom in even more. Look how fine they are. Clear, distinct boundary. One ends and another begins. One ends, another begins. One ends, another begins. That's because it's been known for quite some time to geologists and hydrologists that moving water sorts materials by density, by grain size, and deposits them in strata, which have clear, distinct boundaries from one to the other. And so what you're looking at is proof of the flood of Noah, because the flood of Noah has created the entire geologic column. All of these strata were laid down rapidly during a 1-year-long event called the flood of Noah. These strata cannot have been created over vast ages of time because they would gradiate from one to another. But the fact that we see clear, distinct boundaries between virtually all of the strata going out down throughout the entire Earth to an average depth of 1,800 meters is proof of the flood of Noah. It's proof that these strata were laid down rapidly, else they would gradiate from one into the other. And there would be clear erosion between all of them. But the geologic column, it has an absence of erosion. And the strata, virtually all of them, have clear, distinct boundaries one from another, proving they were all laid down rapidly during the flood of Noah. And so you can tell your university geology professor he's just flat wrong. What he's preaching to you is a paradigm, not geology.
Now, one of the questions that commands our attention at Grand Canyon is what on earth it all means. How did the rock layers that make up the canyon come to be there? What story about the past do these rock layers reveal? What is their origin? Now, the explanation that's presented to most visitors involves slow processes operating over very long time periods, periods of hundreds of millions of years. However, in this talk, I want to propose that there is an alternative explanation for the Grand Canyon and for its rock layers, an explanation that involves catastrophic geological processes operating over relatively short time scales. And I want to suggest that gives us an alternative explanatory framework that helps us to understand the geology that we have laid out before us. Now here in this first slide, we see these two competing interpretations of the geological record in diagrammatic form. In the middle of the screen, you see the standard geological column, a somewhat simplified version of it, with the Precambrian rocks, the Paleozoic rocks or primary rocks, the Mesozoic or secondary rocks, and then the Cenozoic rocks. And on the right, you can see the evolutionary or long age interpretation of this geological succession. Now, the evolutionary or long age view sees the rocks and fossils as a record of evolution over geological timescales. And this perspective is founded on the principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that the present is the key to understanding the past. In other words, we observe today the laying down of sediments in modern-day rivers, lakes, oceans, and deserts, and we assume that the ancient fossil-bearing sediments, like those that we see exposed at Grand Canyon, were formed by similar processes and at similar rates and intensities to those that operated in the past. What is normal or average today is assumed also to have been normal or average in the past. Now, of course, if that uniformitarian principle is correct, then the rock layers of Grand Canyon must have taken tens or even hundreds of millions of years to have been laid down, because sediments today are accumulating in these modern environments on average very slowly. So for many people then, Grand Canyon, with a mile-thick succession of sedimentary layers, is a showcase for slow and gradual geological processes acting over long time spans. However, on the left of this diagram, we see the alternative view, or one alternative view, the creation or the young age interpretation of the geological record. While the uniformitarian geologist adopts the idea that the present is the key to the past, the biblical creationist sees the rocks and fossils instead as snapshots of depositional events at specific times in biblical history. Notably, he interprets a large portion of the geological record as the product of a global flood, the flood that's described in the Bible in Genesis chapters 6 to 9, with other parts of the record representing pre-flood and post-flood deposits. And although there's today still a great deal of debate among creationists about precisely where these boundaries between the pre-flood and flood and post-flood sediments lies in the geological record, the view that I've represented here is one major strand of thinking within creationism, with most of the Precambrian rocks representing Creation Week and pre-flood deposits, and the uppermost part of the Precambrian through to the end of the Mesozoic representing flood rocks, and then with the Cenozoic rocks representing those that were formed in the post-flood period. Now, in this catastrophist framework, the present is not viewed as representative of the Earth's past. Instead, there's perceived to be a major discontinuity between the past and the present. The global flood described in the Bible is accepted as a real and unique event that was responsible for depositing many of the Earth's sedimentary rocks, including many of those that we see in Grand Canyon. So in my talk today, I want to describe just some of the geological evidence, and I have had to be selective for reasons of time, that appears to be consistent with this catastrophist interpretation of the geological record. Evidence which offers us, I think, some helpful insights as we seek to understand the geology of Grand Canyon. But before we look at the evidence in detail, I thought it would be helpful to begin, first of all, with an overview of Grand Canyon itself and its environs. So here we have a map of the Grand Canyon in its setting in the state of Arizona. Grand Canyon stretches 277 miles through northern Arizona, from Lake Powell in the east right through to Lake Mead in the west. The main portion of Grand Canyon attains a depth of more than a mile, and it ranges from 4 to 18 miles wide. And Grand Canyon, along with its 60-mile connection here through Marble Canyon, isolates virtually the entire northwestern corner of the state of Arizona. This is a photograph that I took at sunset on the south rim of Grand Canyon at a place called Mather Point. The south rim of Grand Canyon is at 7,000 feet above sea level. The north rim is just a little higher at 8,000 feet in elevation. And the Colorado River cascades along within the canyon at about 2,500 feet above sea level. And within the canyon, as you can see here, there's a host of pinnacles and buttes, canyons within canyons, precipitous gorges and ravines. The most spectacular of these pinnacles or spires are sometimes referred to as temples, and some of them tower up to a mile or so above the level of the river. Now, of course, this is a desert landscape, and what that means is that we don't have very much vegetation. And of course, that's great for geologists because it means that the rock layers are exposed magnificently to view. And also for the photographer, it allows the sunlight to pick out the varied colors and hues on the rock. And as you watch the sun go down over the canyon, the colors just seem to change all the time. It really is a magnificent sight. Well, let's think then about the geology of Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon exposes a thick sequence of Paleozoic sediments, beginning with the Tapete sandstone here and going up to the Kaibab limestone, which forms the rim. These horizontal sedimentary layers sit on top of an eroded basement of older Precambrian rocks, including sediments, Precambrian sediments like the Bass limestone, the Hakatai shale, the Shinamou quartzite, the Docks formation. There are also igneous rocks like the Cardenas basalts, which are lavas, and various sills and dikes that have been intruded into these sediments. There are also igneous rocks like granites, the Zoroaster granite, and also the oldest rocks are thought to be these various schists like the Vishnu schist. They're metamorphic rocks, if you like, pressure-cooked rocks way down in the base of the canyon. And in the walls of the canyon, the harder layers, the more resistant layers, things like the limestones, the sandstones, tend to form vertical cliffs, and the softer, more easily eroded mudstones and shales and so on, they tend to form slopes. Now, in conventional terms, these rocks span a vast amount of geological time. The Vishnu schist is said to have formed about 1.7 billion years ago by conventional dating, and that was formed by the metamorphism of yet older rocks. So we have some rocks that are thought to be extremely ancient in the base of the canyon. The youngest layer is the Kaibab limestone, which is of Permian age, and that's conventionally thought to be about 260 million years old. Now, I don't accept these dates, but those are the conventional dates that are given, just to show you the span of geological time that is thought to be represented there at the canyon. Now, about 6,000 feet of younger Mesozoic sediments were deposited on top of this Grand Canyon succession. But they've been eroded away from the area around the canyon rim, so they're not actually present there at Grand Canyon. However, if you travel north from Grand Canyon and go into southern Utah, you find that these younger sediments are exposed in a series of steps, which you can see here in this slide. It's become known as the Grand Staircase. And so you can climb up through these younger sediments. And of course, they're magnificently exposed in places like Zion Canyon and Bryce Canyon. But our focus tonight will be on the Paleozoic rocks exposed in Grand Canyon itself. Now, in this talk, I want to consider 5 important observations about the rock layers of Grand Canyon that seem to corroborate the catastrophist model of geology. If the rock layers of Grand Canyon really are the result of a global flood during which the continents were inundated with ocean water and during which living organisms were being overwhelmed on a massive scale, we ought to be able to point to evidence that is consistent with such an account. Now, for reasons of time, as we study the 5 evidences that I've listed here, I can only give selected examples to illustrate each point, but I want to emphasize that these observations are applicable more broadly. And if you'd like further details, I just want to recommend this book, which is a book called Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe, edited by a geologist called Steve Austin. And that has obviously much more detail about the examples that I'll discuss and many other examples as well. So that's a book that I'd highly recommend on this topic. Okay, so here we have these 5 evidences. I'm going to think about fossils of marine organisms that are found high above sea level. Secondly, I want to think about the rapid burial of those organisms. Then I want to think about the extraordinary extent of the sedimentary rock layers exposed at the canyon. Then we're going to think about the fact that there is very little evidence of erosion between the layers, and where there is evidence of erosion, it appears to have taken place by rapid and catastrophic agents. And then I want to think finally about evidence that many of the layers were deposited in relatively rapid succession. So I want to begin, firstly, by thinking about the implications of finding marine fossils high above present-day sea level. On every continent of the world, we find fossils of marine organisms, sea creatures, in rock layers that today are well above sea level. This is certainly true when we come to study the Grand Canyon. The topmost layer in Grand Canyon is the rock formation that you can see here, the Kaibab limestone. This is a photo I took along the Bright Angel Trail as I hiked out of the canyon from the river. Now, the Kaibab limestone is the topmost layer in the canyon. It's exposed on both the south and the north rims. It's at an elevation of about 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. But it's very obvious from the marine fossils found in the Kaibab limestone that it was laid down beneath ocean waters. Ocean waters that must have been laden with lime sediment, and ocean waters that must have extended across much of Arizona and beyond. Another example is the Redwall limestone, which is seen here exposed along the river in Marble Canyon. Now, this formation, like the Kaibab limestone, also contains abundant and diverse remains of marine organisms. And like the Kaibab limestone, it is an extremely widespread formation that extends across much of the North American continent. And I want to come back to the implications of that later. These are just some of the typical marine fossils that we find in the Redwall and Kaibab limestones. We have in these rocks brachiopods, lamp shells, corals, bryozoans, crinoids, sea lilies and so on, bivalves, gastropods, trilobites, cephalopods, and fish remains. Many different kinds of marine organisms are represented. Now, how did they get to their present location? That's the question we need to ask. How did they get to be where they are today, so high above present-day sea level? Well, there's really only one viable explanation. At some time in the Earth's past, the ocean waters must have transgressed onto the high continents. The continents could not have sunk below sea level, because the continents are made up of lighter, less dense rocks than the rocks that make up the ocean floor. And they're lighter and less dense than the rocks that are underneath the continents, the dense mantle rocks. So there's no real way that you can make the continents sink below the ocean. The only viable explanation is that the ocean level must have substantially risen over what it is in the present day, so that the ocean waters can flood onto and over the elevated continents. Now the question is, how on earth did that happen? What is the mechanism to allow that to happen? Now I want to suggest that the Bible's account of the global flood suggests an answer. You see, according to Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11, the flood began with what the text says was the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep. And a careful study of the Hebrew text suggests that this passage is speaking about springs or fountains of water that are erupting in the ocean depths. That's what the fountains of the great deep seems to be referring to. And interestingly, the Hebrew word or the Hebrew phrase that's translated broken up is actually a good geological phrase, because it's a phrase that elsewhere in the Old Testament refers to earthquake activity, earth movements. It describes the breaking or the cleaving of rocks. And these fountains that broke open were open for at least 150 days, the Bible says. So the Bible gives us a picture of Noah's flood, very different from the account that's familiar to us perhaps in children's storybooks. The Bible gives us a picture of Noah's flood as a violent catastrophe that began in the ocean depths and involved the shattering, the breaking of the crust of the earth. Now, the catastrophic breakup of the Earth's crust would have released not only huge volumes of water, but also vast quantities of molten rock. And during the catastrophe, we think that the ocean floors were effectively being replaced along the mid-ocean ridges by fresh, hot flows of lava. This is the process that geologists refer to as seafloor spreading. But if you can imagine this process happening at vastly accelerated rates. Now, these hot lavas that are erupting along the mid-ocean ridges are effectively, because they're hot, they're less dense than the cold ocean floor that they're replacing, that is being subducted along the margins of the pre-flood continents. And because they're less dense, they're more expanded and they're relatively buoyant. And so what would have happened during this episode of rapid seafloor spreading is the ocean floor would effectively have been buoyed up. The level of the ocean floor would have been raised. And calculations and computer simulations that were carried out by Dr. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist, showed that this process could raise the level of the ocean floor by more than 3,500 feet, about a mile or so. Now, because today's mountains, which are relatively speaking geologically recent, because those mountains are not yet formed, and because it's very likely that during the pre-flood period, the mountains, the hills, were nowhere near as high as today's mountains, a sea level rise of a mile or so is enough to inundate those pre-flood continents. So what would have happened during the flood is that ocean waters would have transgressed onto the continents, flooding them, and transporting ocean sediments and marine organisms with them onto those uplifted continents. But then towards the end of the flood, as that molten rock began to cool and as the ocean floors began to sink, sea level would have begun to fall, and the waters would eventually have drained off the continents and into the subsiding ocean basins. Psalm 104 and verse 8, which speaks of, at the end of the flood, of the mountains rising up and the valleys sinking down, may refer to that process. So here we have a mechanism that can explain the transport and the burial of marine organisms on the elevated continents, with the fossil organisms buried in sedimentary layers. And then obviously as the waters drained away, that marine life buried in those sediments was left high and dry on the continents. So that's the first observation. We have to explain how we can have widespread layers with marine fossils blanketing what are now, today, high elevated continental areas. The second observation is what I want to turn to now, and that is the evidence that these fossil marine organisms were rapidly buried under catastrophic circumstances. Now again, I could look at lots of examples here, but to illustrate this point, I want to focus upon one recent example from the Redwall limestone. Now the Redwall limestone, which you see here in Marble Canyon, is the most prominent cliff-forming unit in Grand Canyon. It forms this spectacular 500-foot cliff, and when you're there in a small raft at the bottom of this cliff towering above you, it really is a very spectacular sight. And the Redwall here is about 500 feet thick, but actually it gets thicker. If you trace the Redwall into Nevada, northwest, it gets up to about 800 feet in thickness, and then it thins eastwards into New Mexico. It's actually a light grey colour, but it's usually stained red by a coating of red clays which have been washed down from the overlying rocks. And so this high cliff stained red is obviously where the Redwall limestone gets its name. Now in Marble Canyon we can observe all four of the divisions or members that make up the Redwall limestone. You can see them here in this slide, including the lovely Thunder Springs member with these fantastic sort of dolomite and chert alternations that you can see exposed here. But I want to focus, for the purposes of this talk, on a discovery that was made in the lowermost member of the Redwall limestone, what's called the Whitmore Wash member. Because in 1966, a very remarkable discovery was made in the Whitmore Wash member of the Redwall limestone. The discovery took place here in a small side canyon just about 100 yards or so off the Colorado River. It was discovered that exposed here in a limestone layer within the Whitmore Wash member, there was a bed of numerous large cigar-shaped fossils. Now these fossils are the shells of large marine mollusks called nautiloids. They're a kind of cephalopod. And so from this time on, because of these nautiloid fossils, this small, otherwise pretty obscure side canyon became enshrined on the Colorado River maps as Nautiloid Canyon. Here we see one of the fossil nautiloids that you can see there. Now, in fact, it turns out that these nautiloids in the Redwall limestone are among the largest and the best examples found anywhere in the United States. You can see here with my camera lens cap for scale, you can see this shell here with the chambers of the shell exposed. Now, some of these nautiloids approach 2 feet in length, so they're quite large fossils, and they represent the remains of, as I've said, of a kind of cephalopod. That's the group that includes the living octopuses and squids and cuttlefish. Now, the only surviving nautiloid today is the modern nautilus, from which the group gets its name, a free-swimming, coiled, deep-sea mollusk that's found today in the Indian Ocean. But as you can see here, these Redwall limestone nautiloids are orthocones. In other words, they're straight-shelled nautiloids. However, like their modern counterpart, these fossil nautiloids had what was probably a squid-like animal living at one end of this chambered shell. And the other chambers were pressurized to compensate for buoyancy in a fashion that would have been similar to a submarine. So the animal was able to control its movement in the water, its buoyancy. And this would have allowed the animal to swim around. It could swim freely. It was very active, could probably move at considerable speeds through the ocean. So they must have been one of the important predators in this ancient ocean. Now, travellers along the Colorado River have often stopped to see these unusual nautiloid fossils. Again, you see one here in the rock. It's been wetted just to try and make it a bit more evident for you. However, despite this discovery in Nautiloid Canyon, the received wisdom has always been that nautiloids are very rare in the red wall limestone as a whole. And you can see a quotation here that was from one website on the paleontology of Arizona, which said that these nautiloids are one of the rarest fossils to be found in the red wall limestone. Well, is that correct? In actual fact, thanks to the work of a creationist geologist, we now know that that is not correct. That in fact, the nautiloids in the red wall limestone are much more abundant than anyone previously thought. For many years, Dr. Steve Austin, who you see here, who is a creationist, he's a sedimentologist by training, he has led geological trips into Grand Canyon. He's tutored many students there. And in the 1990s, he began to take an interest in the nautiloids there in Nautiloid Canyon. And in 1995, along with a colleague, Dr. Kurt Wise, who's an invertebrate paleontologist, together these two geologists documented 71 fossil nautiloids in Nautiloid Canyon alone. And they began to consider the possibility that these nautiloid fossils represented a mass kill event, a mass kill horizon within the red wall limestone. Now, a few years later, in March 1999, Steve was camping at Nautiloid Canyon. I think he was there with some students. And he was wondering whether these nautiloids, which he documented quite well there in this little side canyon, he was wondering whether they were perhaps more extensive still. And it so happened that instead of being on one of these large rafts, which are actually quite hard to pull up at certain spots along the river, he had with him a small motorized boat that made those otherwise inaccessible places much more accessible. So he got in his motorized boat and he went down the river and he began to stop at ledges along the river that exposed this particular layer within the red wall limestone. And within a few days, he had discovered hundreds of fossil nautiloids that every geologist up to that point had somehow missed. They just hadn't realized that this layer was so extensive. In fact, it soon became apparent as he traced these fossils along the river that the nautiloid-bearing layer ran the entire length of Grand Canyon, the whole 277 miles. It was a massive layer packed full of these nautiloid fossils. Now, since then, Steve Austin has done a great deal of work in order to record and to document his findings. This map is one that he has published in a paper, which depicts the locations and orientations of 21 nautiloids in one location. They're on a 9 square meter horizon on a stream channel at a place called Jeff Canyon. And Steve says that the abundance and the orientation of the nautiloids at this locality is pretty typical. On average, there's about 1 nautiloid per square meter. So he estimates that in the layer as a whole, there are easily 1 billion fossil nautiloids. He thinks there could be up to 10 billion in this fossil layer. So far from being a very rare fossil, they're actually very, very abundant in this layer within the red wall limestone. Now, what's more, there are some other strange facts about this deposit. Here we have a histogram showing the diameters of shells, of the measured shells. So here we have maximum shell diameter in centimeters and the frequency here. This is data based on 403 of the nautiloids from 3 localities: Marble Canyon, Jeff Canyon, and Garden Wash. Now, the thing I want you to notice here is that we have a complete range of sizes, varying from very small, medium size, right through to large. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that these fossil nautiloids represent an entire population that was buried at a single moment in time. This is not a natural accumulation of individuals over a long period of time. This is an entire cross-section of a population that has just been buried in one single event. Now, what's more, we know that long cigar-shaped objects like these nautiloid shells often tend to line themselves up according to prevailing currents. And Steve Austin did a lot of work measuring the orientation of the nautiloid shells in the Whitmore nautiloid bed. And he plotted the results on Rowe's diagram, showing the compass direction alignment of the shells. And what you see here in this slide are Rowe's diagrams plotted from 185 nautiloids in Marble Canyon, that's the Rowe's diagram at the top, and 152 nautiloids in Garden Wash, that's the Rowe's diagram at the bottom. Now what they reveal, and Steve discusses this at some length in his paper, they reveal a quadrupolar orientation pattern. In other words, there are 4 dominant directions of orientation, but you'll notice that there's a deficiency of nautiloids that have their apex end, the apical end, pointing in the direction of the flow. This is a pattern that tells you that there was a strong flow in that particular direction. And so you can see here, this is the way that the nautiloids are generally oriented, and this indicates that the flow direction was in this kind of direction here, pointing towards the southwest. And here you can see the direction is roughly sort of northeast. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that this fossil layer with these nautiloid shells was not formed by the random fall of dead nautiloids onto a calm and static and motionless ocean floor. You know the view that most people have of how fossil deposits accumulate, animals living naturally in an environment, dying, sink into the seabed, gradually being covered by sediments. This is not how this deposit was formed. These are nautiloids that represent an entire population. They were deposited under the influence of a very strong directional current, probably in deep water. These are not animals that are simply dying and sinking in random orientations onto the ocean bed. One other very curious fact about these nautiloid fossils is their distribution within the bed. The Whitmore nautiloid bed is about 2 meters thick, and the nautiloid fossils are concentrated in the middle of that layer. Not at the top, not at the bottom. They're kind of floating in the middle of this 2 meter thick limestone bed. And furthermore, about 15% of them are standing in approximately vertical orientations within the bed. And what you can see here in this slide is actually the cross-section of one of these shells that is standing in a more upright orientation within the limestone layer. Now, what does that mean? Well, this again was another important clue to understanding how this limestone layer came to be laid down. Experiments have shown that high-speed sediment flows can develop a layered structure with laminar flow, layered flow if you like, at the base of the flow, and then a more turbulent flow at the top. This is a type of flow that geologists call a hyperconcentrated flow. And Steve Austin has proposed this as a model for understanding the flow that deposited the Whitmore nautiloid bed. And as this flow would have moved very fast, it would have been a fast-moving, pretty dense sediment slurry, if you like, it encountered a population of nautiloids living there in the water, and it picked them up. They got caught up and entrained in this flow. And what happens to objects in this kind of structured flow is that they tend to kind of float at the boundary between the laminar and the turbulent flow. So this is why the nautiloids are kind of concentrated in the middle of the bed. When the bed when this slurry came to a stop, came to a standstill and kind of froze in place, the nautiloids that had been caught up in this flow were literally frozen in place as they were carried along in the middle of the bed, many of them standing in upright positions. So let's just try and summarize this. We have here 1 to 10 billion nautiloids buried in a layer of limestone. There's a complete range of sizes showing that this is an entire population. Now together, those two pieces of evidence tell you that you're dealing with a mass kill event, the death and burial of an entire population at one moment. Furthermore, these shells are oriented, which indicates that they were deposited under the influence of a very strong directional current. The shells are concentrated in the middle of the bed, suggesting that it was this kind of hyper-concentrated sediment flow that was responsible. In other words, this limestone bed, and remember it is of canyon length extent, it runs almost 300 miles from end to end through Grand Canyon and beyond, because you can trace this bed into Nevada. This limestone bed was not laid down by the slow and gradual accumulation of lime mud in a calm and placid ocean, which is how we normally envisage the laying down of limestone. This was catastrophic. It was a massive sediment flow that was hydroplaning across hundreds of miles of northern Arizona. And it's also worth noting, I think, that apart from the presence of nautiloids, apart from the fact that this flow happened to entrain this population of nautiloids, the characteristics of this bed are very similar to the other beds that make up the red wall limestone. So it is, in other respects, apart from the nautiloids, a pretty typical bed making up the red wall. So there we have clear evidence in that case of rapid burial, transport and burial of these marine organisms. Well, now we come to our third observation, the extraordinary extent of these sedimentary layers that we see exposed in Grand Canyon. As I noted at the beginning of the talk, the ancient sedimentary layers are usually interpreted in accordance with the principle of uniformity. The present is the key to the past. And that means that modern environments, oceans, rivers and lakes and so on, are used as models to try to understand how the sedimentary layers of the past were deposited. However, here in Grand Canyon, we encounter a serious problem for uniformitarianism, because virtually all the rock layers in Grand Canyon are extraordinarily widespread. And we know from provenance studies that many of these sediments appear to have been transported extremely long distances before they were deposited. The scale of many of these formations is much larger than the scale on which sediments are being deposited today. And it causes us to question, I think, whether this principle of uniformitarianism is really the best principle for understanding how these rocks were formed. Consider, for example, the Tapeats sandstone. Now, the Tapeats sandstone is exposed in some magnificent outcrops in Grand Canyon and elsewhere through central Arizona. You can see it here, a typical outcrop in Carbon Canyon, which is one of those canyons within the Grand Canyon, just off the Colorado River. Now, the Tapeats sandstone forms that basal Cambrian deposit. It's the basal Cambrian deposit of what's called the Tonto Platform in Grand Canyon. It's the lowermost layer that sits on top of that eroded Precambrian basement complex. And the scale of the Tapeats sandstone is absolutely extraordinary. It basically forms an enormous sheet which covers much of the North American continent from west to east and even up into Canada. But even more remarkable, I think, is the fact that similar quartz-rich sandstones characterize the base of the Cambrian, not just in North America, but on a worldwide scale. As the former president of the Geologists Association, the late Derek Ager, pointed out in his book, the nature of the stratigraphical record in 1973. He points out in that book that besides these examples in the United States and in Canada, similar basal Cambrian sandstones can be seen in Great Britain, East Greenland, and even as far away as South Australia. There is a global pattern to some of the lithologies, the rock types that we see in the geological succession. Another example of this is the Redwall limestone, which we've already discussed at some length. And this is another formation that is amazingly extensive. Similar lower Carboniferous limestones stretch right across North America. They can be mapped from the Appalachians into the Midwest. But the most extraordinary thing is that if you go and look at the Redwall limestone, if you look at these other lower Carboniferous limestones in the States, and if you're familiar with the lower Carboniferous limestone that makes up the English Pennines, or that makes up the Mendips, you're not really very surprised. They're very similar. They have the same kind of sediments. It's very similar in appearance. Same kinds of fossils. Really, it's basically the same limestone. In fact, in the Avon Gorge near Bristol, the lower Carboniferous limestone is a very steep cliff-forming unit, which is even stained red by the overlying Perma-Triassic red beds, just as you see here in Grand Canyon. In fact, when I went down the river and we were looking at the Redwall limestone, I said to the geologist I was with, why did you bring me all this way, right across to Arizona to see a limestone that I can see back at home? This is basically the same stuff. Now, these lower Carboniferous limestones have even been traced into Asia. There's a very thick limestone exposed in Kashmir, which Derek Ager once again says is very similar to its British equivalent. It has exactly the same kind of fossils in it. It looks just the same. Now, this is so unlike what we see in the present day. Derek Ager, in his book, later book, The New Catastrophism, published in 1993, said this on page 100. At the present day, we are sadly lacking in carbonate, that is, limestone, deposition, especially in shallow water environments. Apart from very local examples, such as the overworked Bahamas banks in the Caribbean and Sharks Bay in Western Australia, there is also some forming the coral rock down the east coast of Africa and on the west side of the Persian Gulf, but these are nothing compared with the vast extent of shallow water carbonates at particular moments in the geological past. Is the present really the key to understanding the past? Or is there something going on in the past that is very different to what we see happening in the present? That's what I think the evidence is telling us. Let me give you just one final example of this phenomenon before we move on to the next evidence. The Coconino sandstone. Now, the ribbon of cream-coloured rock, which you can see there just below the rim of Grand Canyon, is the Coconino sandstone. It occurs on both the north and south sides of the canyon. It stretches from east to west as far as you can see. It's a very prominent layer that stands out to the observer. And at the moment, I'm particularly interested in the Coconino sandstone because along with two colleagues, I'm engaged in a 5-year project studying the depositional history and the depositional environment of the Coconino sandstone. I don't want to say too much about that this evening, but I just want to to draw your attention to how enormously widespread this layer really is. The Coconino sandstone and its equivalents constitute an enormous layer of sand that covers large parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. The area covered by this sandstone formation is about 200,000 square miles. And the contour lines that you can see on this map indicate the thickness of this layer in feet. It averages about 315 feet thick. It's actually a kind of a wedge shape, so it gets thicker towards the south and thins out towards the north. But on average, it's about 315 feet thick. And it's estimated that the volume of sand in this one formation is about 10,000 cubic miles. So it is an absolutely vast layer of sand. Now, where did the sand in the Coconino sandstone come from? Well, we can study the minerals, and the quartz grains which dominate and the minor portion of feldspar grains are thought to have come from the erosion of crystalline rocks like granites or gneisses or schists, or possibly by the reworking of earlier sand deposits. Now, when we study the cross-bedding, which is a kind of dune structure that's found in this sandstone layer, when we study the cross-bedding, we can tell the direction from which the sand came, and it appears to have been transported predominantly from the north. So we want to look, if we want to find the source of the sand grains, you want to go to the north. The problem is that there is no source of sand grains to the north, at least anywhere that's close by. Along its northern occurrence, the Coconino rests on the Hermit Formation. Now, the Hermit Formation has a finer grained texture than the Coconino sandstone. So the Hermit Formation can't be the source of the sand. Can't be the erosion of the Hermit that gave the sand, because it's too fine. So where do we get the sand from? Well, we're really forced to conclude that the sand in the Coconino sandstone was transported a very great distance, and it's still not really certain where that sand came from. It may have come from a long, long way to the north. Some people have speculated the ultimate source may be the Appalachian Mountains, but certainly it's been transported a very long way. That is utterly unlike the kind of patterns of erosion and transport and sedimentation that we see going on today. It just seems to be on such an enormous scale compared with the present. And this brings me to a related point. On the present day Earth, sediments are being carried towards and within the ocean in all directions, okay, because of local topography and so on, river drainage systems. Material is being transported in lots of different directions. So if the present is the key to the past, when we look in the geological record and we find things that indicate the direction of ancient currents, things like fossil ripple marks, fossil dune structures, what they should show to us is a random pattern, because that's what we see basically on the continents today. We see, and within the ocean, we see random patterns basically determined by local scale and regional scale topography, movements, and so on. So we would expect something that's random. However, a geologist by the name of Arthur Chadwick, over many years, has been collecting what's called paleocurrent data. This is data from rocks, looking at structures that give clues as to directions of currents. He's amassed 500,000 paleocurrent direction measurements. I mean, that's a massive sample of data by anyone's standards. And he's still not happy. He still goes on collecting more and more. But he's got 500,000 measurements or so, and he has a website. There's the web address if you want to go and look at his maps. He's got maps of different continents of the world for different geological periods and so on, and he gives you the paleocurrent data. Now, what's really interesting is what his data has revealed. He's written some papers on this. You can find those on the internet, and some of them published in the geological literature. What you see on the left here is a map of the North American continent showing the prevailing current directions during the Paleozoic. And on the right, the same continent, North America, with the prevailing current directions during the Mesozoic. Now, throughout the Paleozoic, In other words, the time that's represented by those horizontally bedded Grand Canyon sedimentary rock layers, there is a stable and a pretty consistent pattern of currents flowing roughly northeast to southwest across the entire continent. Then, in the Mesozoic, the current direction seemed to shift. Now, these are the sediments that are represented by those younger sediments sitting on top of the Grand Canyon sequence that are exposed in the Grand Staircase. And the direction shifts, but again, it's then consistent throughout the Mesozoic in a broadly easterly direction. What's interesting is that as you approach the present day, as you get up into the Cenozoic rocks, the consistent pattern is lost. And there's no discernible continent-wide pattern once you get up above the Mesozoic into the Cenozoic. And he found a similar pattern on the other continents of the world. Now, this is really interesting. What is the explanation for what he calls these megatrends in paleocurrents? The creationist has an explanation. Because the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, in the creationist view, represent a time when the North American continent was being flooded by the transgressing ocean during a global scale event. They don't represent hundreds of millions of years of processes similar to those going on today. They represent global scale processes on a much shorter time scale. And so, consistent continent-wide patterns might be expected. Consistent currents across the entire continent. The Cenozoic rocks, the more recent rocks, which display no overall continent-wide trend, are usually understood to be either late flood or post-flood in age, when a more normal pattern of drainage was being re-established following that global event. So the creationist has an explanation for these patterns. But what is the uniformitarian to make of these patterns? If the present is the key to the past, these consistent continent-wide megatrends are utterly unlike anything that we observe today. And yet they must have persisted for hundreds of millions of years of geological time. So I think here we have more data that favours the global flood theory rather than the uniformitarian explanation. Okay, our fourth observation. This concerns the apparent absence of substantial time gaps in the Grand Canyon succession. The evidence that the sedimentary layers themselves were laid down rapidly seems, on the face of it, to be very persuasive. However, there are undoubtedly gaps in the record when no sediments were being laid down or when erosion removed sediments that had previously been laid down. And this block diagram of Grand Canyon that you see here shows the position of the most important gaps that are claimed in the Grand Canyon sequence. Now, some are undoubtedly real. There really are some time gaps. Others are more doubtful. The question is it possible that large amounts of time could have passed during these time gaps? Now, we don't have time to look at all of these examples, so I've selected three of the more significant ones. Firstly, I want to look at the contact between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Formation, just here. Then I want to look at the contact between the Red Wall limestone and the underlying Muave limestone, and it's got a bit of what's called the Temple Butte sandwiched in between. And then I want to look at the Great Unconformity, the most significant time gap, if you like, in Grand Canyon, which is between the horizontal Tapete sandstone and the underlying tilted and eroded Precambrian basement. Now, in the first two cases, the Coconino Hermit and the Temple Butte Unconformity, there is very little or no evidence of erosion as we'd expect if the sedimentary layers really were exposed as either an ocean surface or a land surface for prolonged periods. Obviously, in the third case, the great unconformity, there is evidence of substantial erosion, but I want to argue that rapid and catastrophic agents were responsible for this erosion. So let's begin with the first example. Thousands of visitors have a very vivid impression of this abrupt boundary between the cream-coloured Coconino sandstone and this reddish hermit formation underneath as they walk along the Bright Angel Trail in Grand Canyon. And interest in this contact between these two rock formations has been increased in recent years by the discovery of a thick formation that is sandwiched between the Coconino and the Hermit Formation in central and eastern Arizona. It's a formation called the Schnebly Hill Formation, and it approaches a thickness of 2,000 feet beneath Holbrook in Arizona. Now the fact that you've got this very thick formation elsewhere in Arizona between these two formations has led geologists to suggest that more than 10 million years passed at Grand Canyon between the deposition of the Hermit and the deposition of the Coconino. However, take a look at that contact. I wish I could take you there and you could have a close look at this contact. Because when you examine that contact very carefully, you can find no significant physical evidence of erosion at all. Just isn't any. It is an extraordinarily flat surface, free of any kind of channel erosion, as you'd expect if that surface represented a long time period. There are no pebbles of Hermit Formation embedded in the base of the Coconino. There's no soil or weathering profile in the top of the Hermit. So it seems, on the face of it at least, very difficult to make a case for 10 million years of geological time. If there is missing time there, and it seems that there is some missing time, it must be much shorter than 10 million years. When we come to our second example, which is the Temple Butte unconformity between the Red Wall limestone and the underlying Muave limestone, we actually do find, in this case, some physical evidence of erosion. As you can probably see here, channels have been carved into the Muave limestone. Here's one of these channels. And it's been infilled by this limestone formation called the Temple Butte limestone. So we do have some evidence here of erosion. Here's another example of one of these channels. So there is a time gap. The question is, how much time? From a conventional point of view, two entire geological systems are missing here, the Ordovician and the Silurian. So if conventional dating is right, that means that those channels represent a time gap of about 100 million years or thereabouts. Massive amount of missing time. But the only evidence of 100 million years of missing time is about 30 feet of channeling, a slight surface relief. Now, is such a long time gap really justified by the physical observational evidence? The carving of channels, especially if the underlying sediments were poorly cemented, but even if they were well cemented, the carving of channels 30 feet deep does not require long time intervals. Certainly doesn't require 100 million years. But that is effectively the only evidence of that vast time period between the Red Wall and the Muave. Now, the most noteworthy unconformity in Grand Canyon, of course, is the Great Unconformity, which occurs between the Precambrian basement rocks and the overlying Tepete sandstone. And here you can see the Great Unconformity from Lipan Point on the south rim. This is the unconformity surface that you can trace along here. You can see here the tilted Precambrian layers. We have the Docks Formation, the Cardenas basalt, and then on top we have the Tepete sandstone. Now, the conventional view is that the erosion of these Precambrian rocks took place over many millions of years by very slow and gradual processes. Dr. Davis Young, a geologist in the USA, expresses here the conventional view of the Great Unconformity. He says this: "The observed features indicate that the unconformity is an ancient land surface that experienced gentle weathering and erosion over a long period of time before being submerged beneath a gradually encroaching sea." Now, will you note the language that he uses there in that description? This was a land surface. It was subjected to gentle weathering over a prolonged period of time before it was submerged gradually beneath an encroaching sea. Uniformitarianism is involved, obviously, there in that description. Now, everybody agrees that there has been significant erosion on this boundary. Of course there has. But how did it happen? Creationists suspect that the erosion of that Precambrian basement occurred rapidly by catastrophic agents. So, to help us decide whether this view is correct or the catastrophist view is correct, what clues ought we to look for? Well, here we have the Great Unconformity close up. At this particular locality, the rocks below the unconformity are part of the Precambrian Nankoweap formation, and it's the Tapete sandstone that you see above the unconformity. And Steve Austin there has his thumb and his little finger on the two sides of the unconformity. The time gap represented between his thumb and his little finger is thought to be about 500 million years, represented by that erosion surface. Now, if the rocks at that erosion surface had really been exposed at the surface, either in the ocean or indeed as a land surface, as Davis Young claims, for such an enormous period of time, we'd expect to see evidence of that. There should be evidence at this surface. There should be evidence of very deep and extensive chemical weathering of the underlying rocks. We should see evidence of oxidation, acid leaching, the alteration of the minerals. We might expect to find some kind of weathered residue, a soil, something of that kind. However, when we study this surface close up, what we find is that the evidence of chemical weathering, soil profiles and so on is basically missing. It's not there. In fact, in some places, there are minerals in the rocks directly below the erosion surface that would definitely have been unstable had they been subjected to chemical weathering during periods of long exposure. And yet they're there in a fairly pristine state. Now that suggests that this surface was broken up mechanically, that there was physical erosion of this surface. But it appears largely not to have taken place with accompanying chemical effects. There was not chemical weathering on this surface. It was effectively physical, mechanical erosion. So what could have been responsible for physically eroding this surface? Well, certainly we need catastrophic kinds of processes. And recent studies by geologists have in fact suggested that the Tapete sandstone, at least near its base, at the basal section of this sandstone layer, was actually deposited by catastrophic debris flows that simultaneously broke up and transported enormous blocks of the underlying Precambrian rocks in a matrix of sandstone. And these flows were deposited on an eroded surface that has more than 140 meters of vertical relief, which actually indicates that the water depths must have been about 200 meters or more. That's considerably deeper than most people had previously envisaged. Most people were interpreting the Tapetes as a shallow water deposit. It looks as if it was in deep water. and that there are these catastrophic debris flows. And here you see the base of the Tapete Sandstone east of Clement Powell Butte, just above the Great Unconformity, and the large boulder that I've highlighted there is a boulder that's 15 feet in diameter. It's estimated to weigh nearly 200 tons, and it's a block of Shinamou quartzite. It's been moved at least a quarter of a mile from the nearest exposure of Shinamou quartzite. So this was a flow that was capable of transporting enormous blocks of rock. And such a flow would certainly have been capable of deeply eroding the bedrock over which it was moving. This is not evidence of gentle weathering and erosion on a land surface. This is evidence of rapid and catastrophic activity on a deeply submerged surface, which is consistent with the global flood model. Okay, well now I'm looking at the clock and realizing time is racing away. Now we come to the final observation I want to consider in this talk, which is the evidence that points to many layers, many strata having been formed in rapid succession and not separated by hundreds of millions of years. This slide shows some pretty dramatic folding of the Tapete Sandstone in Carbon Canyon within the Grand Canyon. And no doubt you can see the people here. That gives you some sense of the scale. Here we have the Tapetes. It's roughly in a kind of horizontal orientation here. And then it goes into this sort of dramatic upwarp here where the rocks are now in a vertical orientation. Now, rocks that are lithified, in other words, sediments that have been turned to solid rock that have been well cemented, they tend to behave in a hard, brittle fashion when they're deformed. They don't tend to act in a soft and plastic fashion. And normally we can determine the style of folding, the style of deformation in any particular case by a close examination of the rocks involved, particularly using microscope studies to look at the grains under magnification. And in this case, the evidence strongly supports the idea that the Tapete Sandstone was still soft and unconsolidated, uncemented at the time it was folded and deformed. Because instead of fracturing like the underlying crystalline basement rocks did, the Tapete Sandstone instead kind of draped itself over the structure that caused the folding. It didn't fracture. It just draped itself. It thinned out and stretched, if you like, over that structure. And when you look under the microscope at the sand grains, they show no evidence that this material was cemented because none of the grains have been broken or elongated. The mineral cements have not been broken and then recrystallized. So the evidence suggests pretty strongly that this sandstone was still soft and pliable when it was deformed. Now the next question is then, when did the folding occur? Well, we know that the folding was related to the formation of a structure called the East Kaibab monocline. In other words, the uplift of the plateau through which Grand Canyon is actually carved. The Grand Canyon sequence extends over 400 kilometers into eastern Arizona. And when you go into eastern Arizona, you find the same rock layers, but they're at least 1 mile lower in elevation. And that's because the uplift of the Grand Canyon region has caused this enormous fold in the rocks, the East Kaibab monocline. Now we know that that folding event must have happened after the deposition of the Kaibab limestone, because the Kaibab limestone is also folded by the same event. In fact, it's thought that this folding occurred in the late Cretaceous, about 70 million years in the conventional timescale, and then continued through the Cenozoic. So it's thought to be relatively recent deformation. Now let's just think about the implications of that. The Tapete Sandstone is a Cambrian sandstone, deposited somewhere around 540 million years ago, something like that. The Kaibab limestone is about 250 or more years younger in conventional terms. the folding is probably something like 450 to 500 million years after the deposition of the Tapete sandstone. And yet the Tapete sandstone was still unconsolidated, soft and pliable when the folding took place. Is it possible for the Tapete sandstone to have remained unconsolidated for that length of time, particularly when it was deeply buried? Because the factors that should have promoted the lithification of the tapetes were present: deep burial, elevated temperatures, high pressures, driving out the pore waters. It should have been cemented, and it wasn't after all that time. Now, it just seems more consistent with a view that says, actually, there's not that much time separating the deposition of the tapetes and the uplift that then folded it. That seems to make more sense. Now, we see another somewhat similar example. I'll cover this very quickly because of time. We find that in many localities, when you go to look at that horizon, which we've already looked at, the boundary between the Coconino Sandstone here and the Hermit Formation, there are many localities where along the boundary between the two, we find that there are cracks in the top of the Hermit Formation into which sand from the Coconino Sandstone has fallen. So we've got these sand-filled cracks. Now, conventional geology has usually interpreted these as having formed in a desert environment. The idea is this: the Hermit Formation is uplifted from the ocean, it's high on the continent, it's maybe a dry, mud-cracked plain, desert plain, and sand gets transported across this dry, mud-cracked plain, and the sand drops into the cracks, into the mud cracks, and forms these sand-filled cracks. However, my colleague John Whitmore, who has studied intensively these cracks in many, many localities around Grand Canyon, both on the south and the north rims, has found many features of these cracks which strongly suggest that they are not formed by desiccation mud cracks. He finds, for example, that they are not regularly spaced like desiccation cracks. He finds that they often widen downwards rather than just upwards, as desiccation cracks do. He finds that sometimes these sand-filled cracks are even attached to lateral sand bodies within the Hermit Formation, unlike what you'd expect with desiccation cracks. So he doesn't think they're desiccation cracks at all. He thinks instead the evidence strongly points to a tectonic origin, an earthquake origin. He thinks that they are the result of Coconino sand falling into cracks that opened up in the Hermit Formation when earthquakes shook the Hermit. Okay, so the Hermit gets fractured by the earthquake, and then sand falls into the crack. And one of the most compelling lines of evidence that he's found for this is that when you look at the size of the cracks, the width and the depth and the depth is greatest along the Bright Angel Trail in Grand Canyon. If you go to the east, if you go to the west, if you go to the north, the cracks get smaller, they get shorter, and they get narrower. And in fact, they disappear completely as you go well to the east and the west. Now, why is that interesting? Why should they be biggest along the Bright Angel Trail? Well, the Bright Angel Trail runs along a major fault line. The biggest fault that runs through Grand Canyon, the Bright Angel Fault. So he suggests that actually the Bright Angel Fault is responsible for these sand-filled cracks. It was the movement along that fault that caused the fractures to open up in the Hermit Formation, and then the sand fell into the cracks. However, there are some interesting implications for geological timescales if that's the case. Because it is known that the Bright Angel Fault was only active during two parts of geological history. There was initial movement back in the Precambrian, and then it was reactivated up in the mid to late Cenozoic, way up here. And those are the only two movements along the Bright Angel Fault. Now, the Coconino sandstone was deposited here in the Permian. Okay, so we have the Coconino sandstone here. Now, if the cracks that opened up in the Hermit were the result of this reactivation of the Bright Angel Fault, that means that the Coconino sandstone must still have been unconsolidated and full of fluid in the late Cenozoic in order to fall and be squeezed into those tectonic cracks. Now, it just seems more plausible to us that instead of there being a timescale of about 200 million years separating the deposition of the Coconino and the point at which that wet sand was then injected into cracks in the Hermit, it makes much more sense if we kind of tie these layers together and we compress this timescale into a much shorter period. So let me conclude then by just briefly summarising the 5 things that we've looked at this evening. Firstly, we've got the abundant remains of sea creatures preserved in the sedimentary rocks of Grand Canyon, thousands of feet above present-day sea level, and they are a testimony to the inundation of the North American continent by transgressing ocean waters in the Earth's past. Then secondly, we have the extensive fossil graveyards and the exquisite preservation of many fossil organisms, including that mass kill horizon in the red wall limestone, which points to the large-scale destruction of life and the rapid formation of those sedimentary layers. Thirdly, we have the fact that individual sedimentary formations and those that correlate with them can be traced across entire continents, even between continents. Rock layers like the tapetes, the red wall, the Coconino, which seems to indicate depositional processes on a scale much larger than those of the present day. Fourthly, we have those flat knife-edge boundaries like the one between the Coconino and the Hermit Formation, which indicates that there wasn't much time separating them, that there was almost continuous deposition. And where we do have erosion that's evident, it appears to have taken place by catastrophic agents. And then fifthly and finally, we have the layers folded without fracturing or injected into cracks while still in an unconsolidated state, which suggests that the episode of deposition was not separated from the episode of folding or deformation by a long period of time. So in conclusion, far from being a showcase for uniformitarian geology in millions of years, flood geology is alive and well and kicking in Grand Canyon. Thank you.
Could the legends be true and the aptly named City of Giants be named after the real thing? It seems thankfully as time goes on, the truth is slowly being revealed.
But look at the scale. I mean, would a giant feel out of place in that building? Heck no. I mean, it's just built.
Okay, so now we're jumping around a little bit. Now we're in England. And what is this? The Cambridge dining hall. And I just thought this was interesting because this could just as easily have been a church. And it's got kind of the same layout. But what I want to point out here are the windows. So if there were giants, and there's this huge chair that used to be there where the ruler sat of this little fiefdom of Cambridge, and these windows were right-sized for the people. I mean, maybe they had to reach to open and shut the top windows. And I know they have poles on little pivots to do it. I've used it, I know. But it seems kind of dumb to have your windows be that high. I mean, I like it, I actually do. But I'm just talking from construction, from the sensibilities of it. People like to see outside. And it's not, you can't see outside from these windows unless you're really tall.
Okay, so now we're back inside the GPO, the General Post Office in Sydney, Australia. And so this is what they've done with the place. But look at the doorways. See those archways? You can see how the original doorways were on the inside. And why are the stairs so funky down here? Is this how the stairs originally were? Heck no. They had to tear out the original stairs, I surmise, to put in these dinky steps for us. And they had to put in more landings for us because we're so much smaller. We need more landings. If you start falling down the stairs, you need a landing, or else you're just going to keep falling faster and faster down if you're a big fat roll or something. You know, who knows? But if you drop something, you know, it can get up to tremendous speed. That's why they have the landings. It's smart. You know, they used to do things smart. They used to think about it. They used to have brains, right, to do that. All right, so here we have... we're still, that's the GPO building again, and you can see just the scale of it. It doesn't get smaller as it goes up, so it's clearly for giants. It's not even a question in my mind. Now, this is the construction of it, supposedly, right? But all these construction photos are the same. In fact, I saw a few today where I was traveling, and I should have taken a picture, but I thought I'd find it online later, but it's the same thing everywhere I look. The oldest photos they have, it was like this. The windows are out, the building's done, and then they lean a few ladders against it, and they have, sometimes they're working on the rooftop. Sometimes there's no roof, and other times the roof is done. And the clock face, the portholes, you know, those are oftentimes empty in these types of photographs. Sometimes they have scaffolding, but the scaffolding is usually like inadequate or weird in nature. And if you just look at it and think about it, Australia, you know, they show up and they're going to start building these kinds of structures. Now, this photo is very telling. Why in the heck would they? Now, what they say about this is, this might even be San Francisco. It's so hard to tell, you know what I'm saying? But either way, they always say the same thing. It's like, oh, this is right after the earthquake. Okay. So, all right, earthquake. So there's an earthquake. I think this is San Francisco. This is supposed to be like the 1906 earthquake. But it seems to me, the only thing, there are a lot of people here, so that it may be actually what they're saying in this case. But oftentimes you see very few people. It's like they're just arriving and these buildings are crumbled. Now, would they build all these buildings so ornate and so fantastic and then just tear them right down? Well, they claim to do that as well many, many times. And the examples are just almost limitless. Now, something else that tells me that some of this may be newer, you can see the floors are sized for these dinky people that we are. Okay, so this is a courthouse in Australia, New South Wales, somewhere, what's it say, Wollongong Courthouse, pre-1891. So that's the other thing. Many of these early photos, they're undated. And if you look at this, you can see that it is not, the roof is on and the roof looks immaculate. It almost looks like solar panels. Look at it. It's reflective, in fact. Or it's glass. The clock tower, so-called clock tower, it's hard to see if there's a clock in there, but it kind of looks like a reflective material as well. The top of the, do they call that a cornice? I'm not sure. I need to get better on my terminology here. But it looks shiny and new. And are those chimneys? I don't know. But look at this, how it's all fenced off. It seems to have guards. The roads are in horrible shape. It's like, wouldn't you do the road up nice first so that you have easy travels to build this thing? Schlepping all these rocks and things, or stones and blocks and such. Do you want to be walking through like ankle twisting pock mark holes in the ground and bumps and rolly rocks, and then you look through, you can see all the way through the building in some cases. But did they broadcast the telegraph signals? Because they always have those big things sticking up. Maybe they were lightning rods, but that seems excessive. It's very much similar to broadcast. It has to be. It has to be a broadcast tower. It could be a TV receiving antenna. But it is exactly. I mean, if you grew up with those big TV towers, those aluminum ones, it seems to be like that size, maybe a little bit bigger. Now, if all these porthole things are clock faces, my question for you is, why do they have so many of them? I mean, are people like that dialed in? They have to see those clocks all the time, and there's one under the other next to another, one block over from another 4, and then lower down there are another 4, and then the building itself has clocks and clocks everywhere. I mean, even the Prussians weren't that obsessed with being on time. I mean, it's something else. It surely is something else. So this is 1901, Glasgow, Scotland. Exhibition Industrial Hall. Industrial Hall. Does that look industrial to you? And I forgot to mention the flat earth imagery and everything. But you know what? With these exhibitions, you know what they do, and most of you probably know this by now, but if you're new to all this stuff, when they have some really spectacular stuff that they could not otherwise explain, why they would need something so grand for giants, obviously, and so rich for some off in the hinterlands area that hasn't even been populated yet. How do they explain it? Well, they say, we built this for the grand exhibition, and then they tear that shit down, and it's gone forever most of the time, and that's just sad. Now this is Rome. So this is the Forum Basilica Constantine. This photo is circa 1890. Well, isn't that convenient? If it's a really old photograph, it's circa 1890 or circa 1860 or circa 1900. How could they not know the age of the photograph? If photography is new and they do something, wouldn't it be a big deal? I mean, they would know. And just look at this. Now, I'm going to revisit this and see modern photographs of what this looks like. But I was so taken aback by the scale of it that I simply just had to put this in here and publish this video before I continued any more research, because it's just so impressive. And I have seen, you think you've seen it all, right? I haven't been to Rome. I remember studying it, though, in the architecture classes that I had. Well, one class, but it was fantastic. And we covered so much, and we did cover this, but I do not remember covering something like this. It's just the scale. Like, how do they hide it? I don't know how they hide it nowadays, and I'm going to find out. Because it's quite obvious when you look at this that people just kind of walked in. This place had been destroyed, and it was occupied by giants. Look at this. If my voice doesn't sound excited, it should, because when I first saw this, it blew me away. Because this door is like the look at the size of this door and everything else. it looks like it's a kitchen, like it was a doorway to the kitchen, and the stair steps going up to the door. Those are not for mice. Those are not for the puppy. Those are not for the kitty. Those are for grown men. That haphazard stairway they built when they arrived at this place called Rome. And that is clearly a door for giants. There's no doubt about it. How could anybody look at that and not just conclude that that's a door for giants? And the room that you're in, to me, it kind of looks like a kitchen, because those look like it could be like ovens, It just, I don't know, that's my impression just looking at that it's that wall had like a oven set up there, and and see the domed archway behind it. And I know that certain buildings and things, they have grand, but just look at the scale across the whole thing as a whole. Look at the scale. There's the Colosseum and all this stuff. What did they do with all this? I have to have another look, because I think it's all kind of rebuilt up to an extent, but I'm sure they had to leave a lot of it. But the way the rubble just lays around, it just kind of looks like it's antediluvian. And I know that history says no, but it's how it looks. And maybe the Roman Empire did operate out of there, like they say. I have no reason to think that it didn't, but it was constructed at a grand scale beyond that with which we are truly familiar. Because the structures that have grand entrances, grand atriums and things like that, it doesn't continue and continue and continue through the whole thing. I've never walked through an entire building where you're meant to feel like a midget, all the way through. All right, so this, thanks to the channel Wise Up, I can look at this and I can say, this is probably like a giant submarine, or something like some kind of giant boat, or it could be a building, but it could be upside down, but it's not quite level, and it broke up in half at some point, and then this much of it has been excavated, and the authorities tell you, oh, they just kind of carved that shit out of the rock. They didn't. Now, some of it may be carved out just kind of to fool you, but what really is telling is when they're not level, because who would carve something like this and have it not be leveled? Like the straight lines that would be level, like in the, the trim lines along the roof, where the wall meets the roof, and you have it, and it's not plumb or level. It's insane. You can't tell me it's carved that way. You can, but you'd be wrong. And this is clearly compression of materials, and it was beautiful. And I assume that the antediluvian people built this stuff, but some of it maybe not, because when you think of God creating the earth, why wouldn't it have been created with some magnificent order like this? Perhaps created or originally made with the form. It was formless and void, but then he gave it form. But here again, stuff, it looks like it's carved. Now, if they carved this crap out, why would they have carved those gigantic stair steps on the left, center left there? That's evidence of giants. Places like this, if you look down, this whole like so-called firing range, they want you to think they tested like nukes and other bombs here, and maybe they did, right? But the way they test them and everything, the ground underneath it, the ground that they hit before it was pockmarked with these things. If those were even, or if those are bomb craters, I don't know. They could just be sinkholes because there's a like half buried huge city there. And if you look from the air, and they have some of it covered up with sand, and that could be CGI, but it could be actual sand. And they're just working feverishly all the time to deface and cover up what's there. And in this highly restricted area like this, that for some reason, you know, they photographed, they put on Google Earth, you can just see that you have a pattern of a city is already laid out there in exquisite detail, and then it doesn't like let up where the mountains cover it, whatever material makes up that mountain, and it could just be a sand dune for all I know. You know, there are trails, there are walls, there are pathways, there are all kinds of geometric patterns that come out of it. And I realized that some of it, a lot of it may be from, you know, just trails marked out where they go to do their target practice, whatever. But if you're dropping artillery rounds all over the place that are live, and not all of them go off, you know, so it's like a minefield then at that point. Are you going to be driving trucks all around, all over the place? And what is that, a landing strip there? And, you know, you're going to be landing planes on it, and so often that the sand doesn't even cover up the tracks that you make. And it looks like building foundations and walls and things that just are scoured down. And I mean, it's just endless, and some of it's like pixelated out. But you go to a certain year, or you go to a certain angle or whatever, and it becomes evident. People have posted photographs on there. Some of them are relevant to the area, and some of them aren't relevant to the area on the face of it, but they're posted there for a reason. It could be a mistake, but I suspect when you find a lot of those non sequitur photographs posted in some area where it's literally the middle of nowhere, there's going to be a reason. And some of these pictures, they have like a city grid layout, you know, and what was creepy, and I don't know that I included it here, but like in this area, there was a picture of a town, and it was weird. The town had like, looked like chain restaurants and things, kind of just a very, like a modern town, like a picture from like the 90s or something, color, photo, and whatnot. But like I didn't recognize the names of the restaurants or anything. It was weird. It's kind of like the Nuketown scenario, or just like a town from a movie where they have to change the names. I'll have to find that and put that in there. But then it was out here, you know, where clearly there was a city, there was a town here. It has airports. And that's something else, is why in the heck are there airports everywhere? If you look around and you start to pay attention to this, there are airports everywhere. Every little dinky town, a dinky town that has naught but a post office there, where, you know, it has like 3 citizens, and one's the constable and the mayor and the judge and the meter maid and a bunch of other things, you know. But they'll have an airport. My gosh, they all have airports, municipal airports out the wazoo everywhere. And out here in this desert land in the middle of nowhere, they also have it. Some of the airports are like this, you know, or well, maybe this isn't, but it, you know, some of them are, and then others have their actual airports. There are actual airports just like right next to here in this photo, not too far away. There's an actual little tiny airport, even though it's a military base and it has a huge mega service airport like not far away. They still have this dinky airport that supposedly gets used. And then right next to that's another airport, you know, that gets used more. And then right next to that's another airport that gets used maybe less. It's crazy. It's all crazy, man. I mean, look, can you explain, like, what the heck? And if you look at this, in the top of the page, you're going to start seeing this. They have lots of these little things where there are these wires and cables and things like that that are coming out of the ground or going into the ground, and they're spread out, or like sometimes it's all chaotic, and then other times they're all, you know, like orderly, you know, in an orderly manner, they're coiled up. You know, I'll just let you watch for a little bit, and I'm gonna rest I'm gonna quit jawboning it so much, talking too much. Now this is one of the pictures they have right in this area. So that it shows trees. It shows a control tower of the airport, but the airport where this picture was placed is wiped off the map completely, whatever it is. Like maybe it used to be an airport like this, but you don't grow trees out there now, at least. Trees like in this photo haven't grown out there for a long time. Now, the jets also look different. If somebody can identify me, put that in the comments. But okay, so then this, I saw something that said national security site, you know, like off limits, but it's on the map. So I went to it, I started looking around, and I showed you a giant in the last video. I don't know if you caught it, but I was showing you a giant that I found. This is a giant. This is a giant laying on its back. A titan, rather. Beyond a giant. This is a titan. And I'd like to make the statement there, you know, there are no forests on flood. There are no mountains on Flat Earth. There are titans, and there are buildings collapsed, and there are tree stumps, and they are piles of debris, but there's no such thing as a mountain like what they've taught you of the geological processes pushing it up and all that horse manure. Okay, so here I was just picking out random areas. So I found where the road ends, you know, like Shell Silverstein's where the sidewalk ends. This is where the road ends. Coming from the east, the road ends here as far as the Google map goes. And then there are houses and things. It's somewhat inhabited, but the areas where it's not inhabited, you still see these layouts. And then parts of them are like activated where they're using part of this airport. So it's easy to say, well, okay, in the past, you know, they had a base here and they removed the base, whatever. Sure, that explains some of it. But did they remove an entire city the size of Las Vegas 10 times over? Because that's what we're talking about here. If you go to Google Earth and you scroll around and you look, that's what we're talking about, the size of all this stuff. And you know, it's starting to be reclaimed, but it doesn't explain everything. And next to the roadway, it's like they have it done up a little bit more because of the road, because of the access, which makes sense. But you go beyond it and you keep going, and there's still trails and there's still foundations laid out, and there's still whole city grids laid out. And you have to ask yourself, does it still make sense? And the answer is no. So I was looking at this ice wall in Antarctica, and I noticed something. Well, actually, what I noticed first was the fact that the icebergs from Antarctica, like many things having to do with Antarctica, do not resemble icebergs of the north. And as far as I know, in all of the north, there's no ice wall. It's peculiar. Why are there these flat-topped icebergs? Why are there these hundreds of feet tall ice walls only in Antarctica? And why does the ice wall go all the way down to the ocean floor? It seems odd and bizarre to me, and I was researching trying to get answers, and I stumbled upon the Pegasus. Now, this is not the Pegasus from Perseus and mythological dealings with Medusa. No, this is a plane that crashed, and I was looking at that thinking, you know, did that hit something? And so I found that somebody who went to Antarctica talked about how they were in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the cathedral there was destroyed last year in 2017, in an earthquake that happened in 2017. So I started looking into that because I thought, well, they destroyed that. It must have been a mud flooder, and sure enough, it was. And I started looking into the New Zealand history, and this all happened very quickly. And I saw that they first landed ships there, you know, in the early 1800s, and the natives who were there supposedly ahead, you know, in that time, all had died off from measles, influenza. It seemed very, and then the Maori who were supposedly there, you know, many of them died off. Seems convenient. So then the entire island is unoccupied, and there are some whaling ships supposedly that stopped in there. So basically it's untouched by modern civilization. So the first attempt at settling it was by James Harriot, not that James Harriot, not the one from All Creatures Great and Small, but a different one, who attempted to settle in 1840, and they show this supposed house, and it's a barn. It's not a house, and it's buried in mud, and it rotted up to the point at which it was buried in mud. It's pretty obvious to me, and I don't believe that it's the first house and that's dated 1843. So that's like the first family, first house, and they failed. They couldn't stay there. Supposedly, I don't know. Whatever the case, the names of the people, Mansons. I mean, come on. Anyway, so they say, oh, there's this new belief that took place in 1847 that countries like New Zealand could be organized in such a way that they could be planned, the towns could be planned before the settlers arrived. And they would plan it to look like a community back in England. And so I don't know who, but they built all this stuff before the settlement ships arrived, starting in around 1850. And so, you know, they have a story, oh, it got built later or whatever. But I'm not so sure that I believe that, because I see that there are 4 ships loaded full of settlers in 1850. And so where did they stay? Well, they say that there were others who traveled ahead, but there are no ship's logs. There's nothing. And they said, well, where did they live? Well, they lived in supposedly basic huts built quickly and simply. Sure. And that they brought with them vegetables, dairy, produce, and mutton with them. And that lasted them all the time, all these years. You know, it doesn't add up. And so you look at just in 1851, fewer than, 3 or 4 boatloads of people? How many can that even be? Within a year, another 7 came. But these people built the following things, and we'll go through this because this is how unbelievable it is, and it's only a partial list. All right, so wait till what I show you. I mean, so the first school was opened on the 6th of January, and then they already had a newspaper called the Lyttelton Times, whatever, on the 11th of January. 7 days later, they had already built their first bank, the Union Bank of Australia, and they opened it. Oh, and they built a bridge between the 18th of January and February of 1851, or whenever they started it. Remember, they just started arriving in 1850. Oh, and by the way, I saw the ship's logs. It's mostly children, mostly women, and the men are listed on the ship's logs. So if it's not a woman or a child, each ship had, I can't remember the exact number, but approximately 20 to 25 gentlemen, most of whom were in their early to mid 20s, but they had the wherewithal and knowledge to quarry stone themselves, mine the ore and everything, all there, because they didn't bring all that building material with them on the ships. No way. And they built a bridge across the Avon. It was just a footbridge. Oh, well. They had all kinds of streets paved. And then they opened the first shop, supposedly. They didn't say that they built it. They just opened it, and they opened the grammar school. And they began their ferry service. That's interesting. And then they built their first church and later dedicated St. Michael and All Angels in 1859. And I don't know if that's the one I want to show you, but there's another church I think they built, they said, if it was around that time. Just wait till you see that. But we're just getting started. So now I want you to see. So they had another 7 and then another 8, and they brought the population to 3,000 within a year after that. So a town of 3,000, right? So 5 years later, they become a city. And look, the cathedral on Cathedral Square, that's photographed here circa 1888. How, even if their population went up, how in the world did they get How did they build that church? With what? Where did the materials come from? The knowledge, the know-how, the labor. My gosh, do you think you can take a small group of people, and build that church? Are you kidding me? And then they have a map. So among them was a map maker, or somebody went ahead and did all this. This Department of Internal Affairs map, I will show you. It's highlighting sections of land for sale in which, they had surveyed the entire island or nation, or, the entire region of Canterbury, the county, I guess they called it, or township of Christchurch and beyond. And because Christchurch was completed, that's my contention, it was fully built, pristine and completed, and already aged, in place and empty. And prior to 1850 or 1856, it was mapped out and it was shown in place perfectly where it was up until last year, including, get this, 3 canals indicated in the north, southeast, and west of Central City, and the southeast canal ran parallel to Linwood Avenue, and they had Ferry Road, Christchurch Quay, where boats on the Heathcote River could dock and offload cargo. And and that was vital, right? Especially before they built the Littleton Rail Tunnel in 1867. These people dug an entire rail tunnel because they had a railroad, they had a railway, they had a fully functional rail system as well. 3,000 people, mostly children, women, and very young men, and then the few controllers that were there lording over them all. And they have many, many maps. Heck, the one map maker, or however many of them were map makers, must have been just absolutely swamped the entire time, trekking around and mapping out everything to perfection in the 1850s. All across New Zealand. The entirety of New Zealand, right? Or that was already all done, along with everything else. Now they say, I know what they say, that the maps said, or the maps didn't say this. They're saying it about the maps that they were plans. They were just future plans that just happened to be perfectly carried out. How exactly, we don't know. But the province of Canterbury, you can look at these. 1857, it says freehold sections. So they divvied it out. And look at the complexity and details of these maps. I mean, have you ever heard about this? It perfectly planned the whole friggin' place? It's ridiculous. I don't buy it. That city existed. That city was empty. The inhabitants of that city were wiped out. What happened to them? God only knows. I don't know. I don't think, I'm not sure about this, but I'm not thinking that they were antediluvian. Perhaps they were, but it's hard to believe that an antediluvian society's structures to this extent could have survived in such condition. But it's possible, I guess, because we've seen it elsewhere, haven't we? The worldwide deluge, some areas clean up pretty nicely. Maybe they were covered in a light silt, hardened in place, and then wind, weather, and the receding waters just left it out there just pristine, and all they had to do is go ahead, clear up some weeds, and the roads, bridges, everything were all there, all in place, ready to go. So yeah, if you look at the populations, are you telling me that these populations built all this? Because this, remember, is from the year 1857. So these populations they built all this stuff. Now they have the city, township, whatever, of Canterbury censored out. It's blocked out, but you can still see that it's all there. Town of Canterbury. It's named, it's drawn up. And look at how it would you design it that way? It seems like it grew organically to me. Town of Christchurch District. And it's blocked out. I mean, drainage, they have everything's done. Avon District, Christchurch. The bricks areas in red. They have a ferry. They have everything perfectly planned out. So they say, so here, now we jump ahead, and it's just this fully functioning society, and that includes their first and only murder case in which they supposedly executed the perpetrator, who was a woman. And of course, you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If you're going to populate an area and give them a false history, they bring in children. Like the orphan trains I've heard about, orphans and orphanages used to be a really big thing, weren't they? I don't know if you're old enough to remember. I mean, I have a kind of a longer memory than a lot of people, because I knew my grandparents. I've been around my parents a long time, and like I said before, that there's a lot of wisdom there, and I've absorbed it, and I know at least one of my grandparents themselves came from an orphanage, or was in an orphanage, maybe not came from, but at one point was in an orphanage, and that's kind of a bizarre thing nowadays, and they say, well, that's a cultural change, but I don't think so. I think they had huge orphanages. Like if you look at the movie, there's one, Boys Town is the name of it, and it's about an orphanage, and there are these huge buildings, and then the older stories, they involve them. But anyway, this woman was a caretaker for an orphanage, and she did the unforgivable crime because they wanted to populate or repopulate the area, and so some babies died in her care, and she tried to cover it up, probably because there were so many babies she thought nobody would notice, but they noticed, and then carried out capital punishment, supposedly. This is what they report. So that's in the late, the 1890s. But what's now? Get this. Now, why do I say it's a fake, made-up history, and why do I say supposedly? It's like, hey, you just don't know. You don't know how to read. You don't know how to understand things. You just don't read it and think about it. No, I read it, I think about it, and I see if it makes sense. Now, on August the 12th of 1895, Minnie Dean was hanged for this crime, right? And so when did it happen? In May of 1895, she was seen boarding a train carrying a young baby in a hat box and blah, blah, blah. And so that's when the crime happened, May 1895. Now get this. So you read down and through the story, and what I noticed was, so already in 1895 of that same year, so May, June, so it only took a month, and they found her guilty of murder and executed her a few weeks later. So it was about 2 months from the crime to the execution, right? Where is it? On the bottom, they say, it was an unusual course of action, and her trial and execution story generated public interest in the case. So the public interest in the case was high, and souvenirs of her hat box. So it's not any other cases, it's her case, the hat box, notoriously being outside the courthouse during her trial, led to major advances. Or I'm sorry. they were selling her hat box outside the courthouse during her trial. So it's like like a show or something. And it entered into the folklore and led to major advances in New Zealand's child welfare legislation with the passing of the Infant Life Protection Act in 1893 and Infant Protection Act of 1896. Well, her trial and execution took place in 1895. So what kind of scholarship is this? This act enacted in 1893 was in response to something that happened in 1895? Hello. So anyway, just ridiculous. So these ships that are coming, right, they have 35 passengers in this one case, and they had an accident and the native people helped the person. And what did they get for it? They got a medal or something. What was it? A watch. They got a gold watch. Saving the lives of these people. And okay, so here you have the ages of the males aboard the ship. Not the adult males, right? I mean, I say adult. Some of them are not that old. Some of them are only in their teens or like preteen even. But anyway, so then we're jumping ahead a little bit. So we're going into the 1900s now. We'll kind of go back and forth, but I want to show you so they build up all the cities and buildings and everything, right? Supposedly. Well, here's one of a physicist who worked supposedly on the splitting the atom and whatnot. Now, I didn't read anything that he wrote that was of any significance. And then here they have pictures of his laboratory, which are a joke. You're telling me that in this laboratory, he did significant work on splitting the atom? My laboratory looks better than that. You know what I mean? Mine's nothing special. But the building really caught my interest. It's buried. It's an old buried building, and look at it. I'm not going to go through everything, but the telegraph wires or power wires they have, and it's leaking, where the walls are underground where they shouldn't be. And the windows were like half buried. It slopes down, and it's just the tin box, they called it. And I mean, just look at it. And they have it covered up with these curtain things. And what a mess. What a joke. They obviously recovered this building. This one, and that shows you how much they really valued the advancement of science. I mean, he's got a heater underneath the curtain, and this is the top scientist. And they have like a wooden platform built up because so much water leaks in that they'd be stepping in water all the time. So they just have the wooden planks down. I mean, what a joke. All right, so here we have this map, and they show road to Kush. I can't really read it that well. Road to Kush, and it's unfinished, this road. And then they have the gold mine, and it says presumed unoccupied land. They hadn't killed everybody off yet, maybe. And that's, this is 1896, okay. But then there's another one where it says 88, which would be, 1888. So I don't know. Let's say it's 1896. And then they have this stamp that says December 8. And then it looks like 1883 or 1383. So maybe the original map was made in 1383. I don't know. I mean, you tell me. I'm not sure. And then one is darker and different than the other one. So it may have been December the 8th, 383. I don't know. Auckland, New Zealand, Landsat survey. And the other thing that catches my eye on these maps is that it says a diagram showing connection now abandoned, see plan, and it's like the Library of Auckland or whatever, and that may be more recent, but not according to the date. And the fact that they had that much autonomy is surprising, because at that time they were just the crown. They had all this crown, the royal, Her Majesties, His Majesties, whatever, and to just say Department of Land Survey, Auckland, New Zealand, that doesn't work. So, and then these dates typed over, and it says 1880 something, and they just wrote 96 over top of it, obviously. And I understand that can happen, but a lot of them are this way. So, and then it references the Mining Act of 1891. Okay. Then they have the mining incident in 1899. So they have gold there, and Gold Estates claims. That's where the maps come from. So the church, they had this earthquake, and what's curious about the earthquake is the church was damaged, and they pulled it down. They had it fenced off, and then if you look at the old picture of the church, it was fenced off from the beginning. So they had it fenced off in the beginning, and then it's damaged, but the buildings around it in the earthquake weren't damaged. Only the oldest district in Christchurch got leveled. Not by the earthquake necessarily, but they cordoned it off as unsafe, and then they bulldozed it. So basically, they bulldozed it. And if you look at the building, other than this one part of it where looks like they set off a bomb, and the one side, it looks unharmed. It looks easily recoverable. And it has the flat earth dome thing, and of course it's oversized. It's sized up for giants. And I think they just demoed it. So, the mud flood, I think this is a good primer into the mud flood issue, because you can see how one thing leads to another. So I'm looking at Antarctica, and then I'm reading about an Antarctic expedition. And then, they're kind of in the know about these things. It's compartmentalized, but they happen to notice, whether it's conscious or not, that it seems odd that they're like, oh, I should have taken more pictures the last time I was in Christchurch, New Zealand, because the beautiful old buildings downtown are all gone all of a sudden, and it's because of the earthquake, supposedly. The earthquake strikes, it not officially in the center of the city maybe, but they say, oh, it affects the older buildings the most, right? Which doesn't make sense. Oh, well, they're building the newer buildings to handle earthquakes better. I don't think so. I think what makes sense is the buildings that have lasted the longest have proven themselves to withstand the earthquakes the best. I know we can have a more severe earthquake, but in general, the buildings we build today, aren't they cheaper and crappier than the old ones? From the looks of it, they certainly are. And the materials are less solid, and I know you want flexibility, but if you take a super huge heavy stone structure and that's almost seamless stones and everything, hardly any mortar, and shake it, it could still flex, but it's not gonna, it's not gonna fall apart like how they show. It's ridiculous. And then believe them, the inside when it was cordoned off and whatnot. But if you take a look at the pictures from before they destroyed it, you can kind of see why they destroyed it. And it's a shame. but it's also because it's a clue into the past, and they almost got away with it too if it wasn't for these meddling channels.
Now, I always wondered why city managers were the highest paid government officials. I mean, the highest paid. The city manager of Miami, for example, makes close to $1 million a year. It's like, it's crazy. But now I'm beginning to understand. If you look at this city manager of Christchurch, he's making $540,000. Well, okay, $450,000 US dollars a year, and he got a pay raise that was after the earthquake, in which he was off at some event gallivanting around, didn't bother to come back to manage his city in the wake or in the aftermath of the earthquake, and he got a substantial pay raise to the tune of something like $76,000 a year or $56,000 a year, which was more than a lot of the legit first responders who were doing amputations and things on the scene for the victims caught in the rubble. I'm telling you, I mean, it goes without saying that I suspect them of having a hand in the earthquakes themselves through resonant frequency technologies. We've known for a while that they can do that. Now look at this railing. I mean, do you see it? This is from the New Zealand as well. Check it out. That's the original railing. That's for giants. Because there are two things you have to redo in a building to hide the fact that it was built for giants. And one of them is the stairs, and the other one is the bathrooms. You have to remove all the bathroom toilet fixtures and things, and you have to remove the stairs. It's too obvious that it was for giants. The rest, you can retrofit some lower thresholds in there to kind of create the illusory effect that they didn't have, create the illusion that they didn't always have the higher thresholds throughout the building. And even though the building's probably fine to use in most cases, they just find a reason to abandon it. And if you read the comments, like at the Erskine School that they abandoned, a lot of these things that they abandoned, people really liked it. And then this was bizarre, talking about empty cities. In Beijing, they built the Swiss city. It's never been used, and it's kind of a mix between Switzerland and Italy. So I guess it would be like the what do they call that area in northern Italy? It's got Vipiteno in it. The Tiroli part of Italy is what it's like, which was once part of Austria, actually, before it became Italy. But you can look at that. But here's more. So the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. Now, I don't doubt that it rumbled, but it seems like they had some of the buildings set up to fail, and it's reminiscent of 9/11, where like this building, they evacuated people. This wasn't even for an earthquake. They just had a building evacuation, like they deemed it was structurally unsafe. They have the military in there. My gosh, give me a break. Then the news reporters, they all had scripts over in English Parliament, they had a script. The guy read a script. Many buildings were destroyed. First reports, many of the old buildings were destroyed. And they really took out a bunch of the news reporters, the CTV, the whole building. Sudden catastrophic collapse. Hundreds of people died. And so in the immediate aftermath, I watched some of those videos, and boy, the police presence, military, they cordoning off areas, directing people not to look certain directions. It's crazy. And if you look at some of these pictures, you can see that there are structural beams that are cut clean. So that's reminiscent. That's what I meant by that. And then I already showed you some of the pictures. It looks like they blew dynamite on some of the corners of the buildings, and they only have to do a little bit of damage, superficial damage even, would work, because then they can just declare it structurally unsound and have it raised. And that's what they did with that Christchurch cathedral. There was a society that fought for the preservation of it, but just over a year ago, 2017, they tore it down finally after fighting over it, because this main earthquake was in February the 22nd, 2011. So it set in motion the series of events which led to the complete tearing down of the old buildings in New Zealand, and it's to the point where the tourist agencies, I went to a tourist website where they had the walking tour through the old downtown, where they say, this is an interesting area of the Canterbury Parish Township of New Zealand, specifically in Christchurch, where they had built buildings meant to look old. Well, but now the tourist website, they have nothing. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to see. Nothing. So they said, so the tourist website that once had, 15 pages on, 15 galleries on the 15 different structures that were of high interest to visitors and tourists, they just direct them to this coffee shop has good coffee, and over here people have a nice smile and a good Danish to eat. It's just sad. And the city manager obviously paid off with it. And people are up in arms over the city manager, yet he's going nowhere. I mean, because he's the golden child for the elites, the powers that be, the ones behind all of this. It's just... So now you understand. And I don't see anything else like this. In the videos I watched about the earthquakes made by the people who were there, and then the comments, there's a lot of confusion to this day. So this video may clear that up for them. But I went on and I've read a bunch of stuff about the there's a whole bunch of stuff. Oh my gosh, it's just a treasure trove of this stuff. They have battlements supposedly built on this one part where there was a landowner. Obviously the guy got land, and there were these huge concrete bowls. What they are, I'll tell you what they are, but let me tell you what they say first. They're supposed to be World War II bunkers for artillery, and they have roads to it, and it's all overgrown, and it was not, the public could not see it, but then they had to let the public see it because of an ongoing court case in which they acquired rights to it from the private landowners. So they couldn't just take it from him and not do anything with it, because the law doesn't allow that. But the law does allow them to take it from him for the public. But then the public had no interest in seeing it because they didn't know about it really. And so then they took it from him for the public. So then they opened it up to the public for a period of, I don't know, 10 years maybe. And then they closed it down recently, and it's never going to be seen by anybody. It's like a nature off limits, whatever. And the story is that it's these guns that were never used, and they were built too late for World War II, but they started construction on it supposedly in the 30s or before. And then so I looked into the court case, and it was a lot of reading, but it was worth it, because the man is saying things like, I didn't build, he's saying things like, in so many words, that he didn't build the roads, that they must have built the roads before, like before anything. And he, even though he was alive at the time, he was born, like he was born in the late 1800s, but I don't think he acquired the land till he was a little bit older. He kind of knew about it, and then he acquired the land, and he died in the 1980s, but they had taken it from him. And during the court case, they kept saying, like, they were recovering the road or clearing the road, and there's all this stuff about how the road ends and they have a fence, and he wanted them to, if they're clearing the road, to put up the fence to imply that the public's not to trespass on his property. And the road didn't even go to these bunkers. I mean, some of the roads did, but the road that they wanted didn't go to the bunkers. And then they kept finding more roads and finding more stuff. Okay, so the bunkers were built with just a little bit of money in secret, and then the workers it's one of these things, like the few workers who built this massive stuff, nobody knows who they are, when they even did it, where it all goes. And then there's miles of tunnels, and it all connects up to everything else. It's just obvious to me. And then I looked at it, what is supposed to be these gun turrets. I looked at it and I thought, that is straight up a trundle station. For baggage, for luggage, for packages, for their transportation system, which could be by ship, it could be by air, by dirigible or whatever else they had. And eventually it gets taken over to the train system, which they had extensive trackage for all over New Zealand, in place already for the most part. So they needed a place to sort packages, and it makes sense to do it up high and then use gravity, buoyancy, up, down, to let that take it down once they get it sorted. And so like a bowl feed sorter machine with optical or visual or manually operated separators, the baggage or the luggage packages, just like UPS does, don't need to go through tunnels any larger than the size of the packages, and it makes sense to have a wheel system on which to turn it. And it's a trundle station for trains, which means that the train system that they had was massive. It was a huge, complex, comprehensive train system that covered the entirety of the landscape. And like that first bridge they built, Avon Bridge, has train tracks going over it, and the electric trolley
this was where the one of the trolley stations was, and they had several trundle stations for multiple cars. That's exactly what it is, I am telling you. And this is in a remote, huge piece of property that was only owned by, I think, 2 or 3 people to this day before the government took it. So it's 100%. And then you read through this case and there's all this confusion. The government pretty much admits that that somebody, not they, but that somebody went and built the roads and left them abandoned before any of it, before all of it. So it's there, right there. I mean, what else? What other kind of evidence do you want? I mean, but then they accused, and it's really sinister because they accused the landowner. Ultimately, the way they got the land was, they said that whenever he was gone because he had a stroke, and they said, you know, the public was traipsing along, and when he allowed them to clear part of the road with the stipulation that they would put up a fence so that the public wouldn't use the road. He didn't know why they want to clear partially the road but not use it, because he had conditions. He said you can't connect it up to this other side of the property where people will start using the road unless, you know, you do all these things. And they said, well, they didn't want to do that. They just want to clear some of it. And so he said, okay, put up a fence. And so they said, okay. And then when they did it, they didn't put up the fence. And then he has a stroke and he has a lawyer checking on it for him. And then the lawyer doesn't do the due diligence. He didn't do his diligence. But the government said, well, people just started using it. And the fact that we didn't finish building the fence is your fault that you didn't say anything. And so the guy ends up suing his own lawyer. And then by that time, you know, because of the stroke, his son's taking over, and his son doesn't give a crap. And because he knows that his dad got lied to by the government over and over and over and over again. And the government even straight up told him that they wanted to take it over for a nature park or whatever, which they did. But then that was even a lie, because they took it over for all that and then they closed it down. And then with everything going on, they doubled down during the lawsuit and claimed that they wanted to then build a walkway along the waterfront, oceanfront, for the people to walk all the way along the coastline through the entirety of his property, and that somehow they built that just while he was on vacation or something, or what you know, one of them was on vacation, the lawyer or the son, I don't know, whoever was supposed to be watching. Well, obviously that was already there too, and all they did was lay claim to it. And then one of his legit claims or complaints against the government was that, hey, you guys, this wasn't on the deed when I bought the property, these roads, these walkways. It doesn't mean that they weren't there, but they weren't on the deed. And so the proper way for them to go on the deed would be for whoever built it to claim that it was, you know, to take out the license or get the permission, the permit to build these structures. And he said, I'm not claiming that I built any of this. You guys are claiming that you did because you're saying that you built these bunkers, but you didn't put it on the deed. And so how is all this my fault? I don't even have the wherewithal to build these things. The government just responded by, well, that's not our problem. We changed the laws and rules, and we made assessments about drainage and fencing, and you didn't do your part. So you're screwed, We're taking it from you. We're giving you nothing in return. It's ours now. And then we're taking it for the public. But then they turn right around and it's all shut down. It's all shut off. Just last year, a little over a year, 2017. And it's all shut off from the public forever, you know. So the only pictures we have of it are when it was open. And there was even like a society created because people started exploring the tunnels and things and finding out, my gosh, these tunnels go for miles. And they're starting to figure all this stuff out and find out. I mean, they were just asking questions and they were fascinated by it, you know, because New Zealand, you know, way out there. So.
Hey guys, it's EntertheStars, and this is probably going to be one of the most important videos that I've done, so I'm just going to get right to it. This is to silence the critics, all of the critics who do not believe that the Nephilim bloodline has infiltrated the human race, and that Jesus is the only way to purify our blood. I'm going to show you the exact lineage of the Nephilim bloodline down through the ages, and why the judgments happened against certain peoples in the Bible. I've actually been able to, through much research, come to the conclusion that this in fact is the case, that the Nephilim bloodline has proliferated through our history. Now we're going to start here. Who was Ham? Well, Ham was of course on the ark, and we know that Ham was of pure blood. We know that because Noah was of pure blood, and we know that Noah's wife was of pure blood. So Ham was not the one that actually had the corrupted bloodline. It was Ham's wife who had the bloodline, and I'm going to explain to you why. Now, it says here that Ham begat Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. Okay? Now, let's take a look at these names specifically. Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. Mizraim we know is Egypt. Now it says here that Mizraim begat the Naptuhim. Does that sound like Nephilim to you? It also says that he begat Casluhim, of whom came the Philistines. Now Mizraim was the son of Ham, of course, which is Mizraim is Egypt. So through Egypt we had the Philistine bloodline, and of course all the Pharaoh, which we see supersized in the hieroglyphics throughout Egypt in the modern day. And of course we identified the Philistines as having the giant bloodline as well. Now Cush actually begat Nimrod, so Cush was Nimrod's father. Okay? Canaan was also a people that is mentioned in the Bible that were of the Nephilim. We're going to show you that. Let's go on to the next part here. Here it says that Cush begat Nimrod, and Mizraim begat Ludim, Ananim, Lahebim, and Nephilim. And Canaan begat the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites. These were all people that had judgments against them. Now we have already identified that Ham's wife was Nephilim because Canaan was cursed, and I'm going to show you the bloodlines from Ham of giants mentioned in the Bible after this point that prove that Ham's wife was the one who carried the gene. Okay? Now we're identifying here in this portion that Canaan begot all of these people that had judgments against them, the Jebusites, the Amorites, and I'm going to show you that later. I just wanted to establish to you the Cush bloodline that came from Ham. So we've done that here. Now, it goes on here to talk about the Canaanites. We're in Deuteronomy. And this is the judgment that God made against those peoples that we just mentioned. The Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites. Remember, these all came from Canaan in this slide here. Jebusites, Amorites, Hivites. Okay? The same people. They came from Canaan. And that is why God had to make the judgment against them, to annihilate their race. Okay? Now we're following the bloodline. Now here is where we tie in all of the tribes that were mentioned that descended from Canaan. And we tie that in to the actual Nephilim and the giants. This is the story of the scouts that had gone out from the camp of the Israelites, from Aaron and Moses, to scout out the land. And they went to the different lands, the lands that were mentioned as descendants of Canaan. These lands were the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Amalekites. Okay, these are many of the names that are mentioned that were descended from Canaan. So what did the scouts have to say? Well, the scouts said that of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, the land through which we have gone to search it, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. Where else do we hear about cannibalism? We hear that in the book of Enoch. The Nephilim consumed men. And here it is in our Bible, showing the same thing. And all of the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. All of the people. So all of these peoples that we just mentioned, which were descended from the Canaanites, were of great statures. And of course then they say, we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. Now here are some specific people that weren't associated with any bloodline that the Bible actually calls straight out that they are giants. And it says here, they were giants. We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. So they were so small, they were small as grasshoppers, but the Bible comes right out and says that they are giants. I don't know why people are so resistant to this idea. And that's not just one story about giants. We have Og of Bashan, and it says here that Og was what remained of the remnant of giants. Okay, this is in Deuteronomy. His bedstand was a bedstand of iron. 9 cubits was the length. Now, a cubit is about 1.5 feet. It's the distance from the end of your fingers to your elbow. And 4 cubits was the breadth. It calls him a giant. Now again, Og, we cannot relate specifically back to the Ham bloodline, but I'm just showing you examples of other giants in the Bible. Here's a man from Gath with 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand. Okay? And it says here, there was a war against the Philistines, with the Philistines. And Elhanan, the son of Jair, slew Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, whose spear staff was like a weaver's beam. So once again, they're giving you a point of reference of the size of this person. Okay? The Philistine was a giant. How do we know? Because it tells us here in 2 Samuel. These 4 descendants of Rapha and Gath, they fell into the hands of David and his men. These 4 Philistines were descendants of the giants of Gath. The Philistines were giants. Again here, there was a war at Gath. There was a man of great stature. These were born into the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David. David was the pure bloodline. The pure bloodline is explained here in Genesis. It's the line of Shem. Shem is the pure bloodline. Shem, Semite, the true Jews. Okay? And the Bible makes it a point in Genesis 10:21 to go through and talk about the bloodline of Shem, to show that it is pure. And they track it all the way down through Abram. And then they track it further in other books of the Bible. But they get us to the point of Abram in late Genesis and in the book of Genesis. Here we have another giant named Rapha, and another giant named Saph. And I'm sure you're starting to see a pattern here, where the Bible actually compares these giants to objects so we can get an idea of how big they are. In this case, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. Now, 300 shekels is a very heavy spearhead. it is 5 to 10 times the normal weight of a normal spearhead. Spearheads had to be light and agile. It says here, in the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sabiki and Hushathite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. So Saph is another giant. So where are we at now? It says here, the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. That's Numbers 13:33. We seem like grasshoppers in their eyes. So we have very specific verses showing us exactly what we're dealing with here. The one I think that is most descriptive of where these bloodlines came from is here in 1 Chronicles 1. And it actually names the different tribes that spun off from Canaan. Okay? And then we of course know that Canaan was the son of Ham. Okay? Now hopefully this is making sense to you guys, or at least giving you some references to look through and follow this through. Okay? Because it has been a point of contention. People are very resistant to the fact that amongst all these giants mentioned in the Bible, and I haven't even covered all of them, that we somehow avoided mixing the blood of the Nephilim with the human race. That's ridiculous. It's almost like saying we don't have the blood of Adam. Of course we have the blood of Adam. We descended from him. And as you know, races mix with each other. Now there is one more reference in here that I didn't pull up, and it talks about God telling the peoples, do not mix with these people. It says, do not mix with the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Hivites. Why would he say that? Because of the corrupted bloodline. Okay? He had to keep the bloodline pure down through to Jesus. Okay? So, this is open for discussion, of course, but here's the proof, you guys. We have mentions of giants throughout the Bible. We have the peoples that were annihilated by God, and the peoples and the Israelites. The Israelites were told to annihilate these people. People descended from Canaan. Canaan was cursed. Canaan came from Ham's wife. Ham's wife carried the Nephilim bloodline. We had the Philistines, Anak, Og, all of these giants mentioned in the Bible. You cannot avoid it. It is there.
When you look sort of at the family tree here, you got Noah, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Of course, Canaan is loaded with giants when you look through his lineage. Mitzrayim has one, at least as far as I could tell, and that's Caphtor. Caphtor is the father of the Philistines. And we know of at least 5 giants of the Philistines, right? Goliath and his 4 brothers, who were born to the giant in Gath. There's no evidence of giants that I could find in Put's lineage. There's one in Cush's lineage, and that's Nimrod, but I don't believe he was born that way. The text leads you to believe that he did something to himself to alter himself and became that way. But I don't believe that Cush had any natural-born Nephilim. The Amorites are mentioned over 80 times in your Bible. The Amorites were huge. Amos 2:9 says they're so big they got their size of cedar trees. These guys were huge, mentioned over 80 times. The Amorites come from Canaan, son of Ham, as Moses just said in the prior verses. Philistines, again, mentioned over 200 times in the Bible. Incidentally, Caphtor, the father of the Philistines, settled the island of Crete. Well, if you study mythology, you'll find all of Greek mythology originates in Crete. So if you want to figure out where your Zeus and some of these guys come from, well, it goes back to Caphtor, son of Mitzrayim, son of Ham, who got off the ark with no mention of angels anywhere in the picture. Shem, there's no giants that I could find, or Nephilim in the lineage of Shem that I could find, which is a good thing, because who's in the lineage of Shem? Yeshua, Jesus, right? Japheth, we don't get this in Scripture, but if you just do a Google on Gog and Magog plus giant, you'll see that throughout history, Gog and Magog were recognized as giants in the historical record. I stood on the Great Wall of China in 2006, And if you've never been there, let me just tell you, that's an amazing structure. It's huge. And while I was there, I came to find out that originally it was known as the ramparts of Gog and Magog. Well, all of a sudden it started to make sense, because if you're standing on this massively huge structure, it's serious overkill if you're just trying to keep out 6-foot-tall invaders. But if Gog and Magog are 18, 20-footers, well, all of a sudden the Great Wall of China makes perfect sense. You know, and actually Geico gets it right. The Geico commercials, you ever watch the Geico commercials? They show a Geico commercial where they look like Mongolians or something, come up on and they're giants. They come up on the Great Wall of China, it's like this high, and they're looking, what do we do? And this other guy just looks at it, he steps over it, and they keep walking. You know, I think Geico, you know, believe it or not, figured it out. But there are giants in the lineage of Japheth, if you believe Gog and Magog are giants, which puts a whole new spin on the Gog-Magog war when you read the book of Ezekiel, if you put it in that perspective. Again, I want to point out that Canaan was cursed, not Ham. Not all of Ham's offspring were corrupted. There's no evidence of bad genetics input, and I've kind of covered this already, so I'll move on. But I want to play a little video clip here talking about how genetics work, specifically with mutations in DNA and things of that nature.
DNA is the inherited material of life, and it is where genes are structured. So we inherit half of our DNA from our mothers and half of our DNA from our fathers. And within the DNA are the genes that encode for all the structures of the body. So the DNA is like a blueprint. Just like an architect has a blueprint for a building, the DNA is the blueprint for all the structures of the body. So when a gene is switched on to function, the information within that gene is being used to manufacture a protein. And that protein then builds the structure of the body. And then proteins in the form of enzymes carry out all of the chemical reactions of the body that constitute the living organism. The process of genetic modification is a completely irreversible process. Once it has been carried out, it affects the reproductive cells of the organism. So any effect you have, for good or for bad, is then passed down through the subsequent generations of that particular organism. And that's true for plants and animals, indeed for any genetically modified organism.
Did you follow that? It's not, you can't reverse it. Once it happens and it passes down to reproductive cells, your offspring is going to have genetic modifications passed on to them. And again, I believe the scriptures tell us exactly where the post-flood Nephilim came from. For instance, we have scriptures like this. This is one of those cases where we read about God commanding the Israelites to utterly destroy them, and he names them. Namely, the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Okay, well, where did they come from? You got the same names right there in Genesis chapter 10. Tells you exactly where they came from. Backed up again with the previous chapter where it says, these are the three sons of Noah, and from them was the whole world populated. When you look at the meaning of their names, how many of you have heard Chuck Missler's talk on the pre-flood patriarchs, the first 10 patriarchs before the flood? If you take the meaning of their names in Hebrew and just string them together like a sentence, you end up with, man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching that with his death the despairing shall find rest. Well, I mean, that's like the plan of the whole Bible right there in the names of the first 10 patriarchs, right? So I started to think about that. I said, how often that applies? And let me tell you, the best $5 I ever spent in my life was on the book, A Dictionary of Scripture Proper Names. A Dictionary of Scripture Proper Names by J.B. Jackson. All it is, the whole book is just the names in the Bible and what their names mean. Now, all of a sudden, when you go to all those passages where you know, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and you're like, yeah, blah, blah, you skip it because you can't pronounce the names? No. Gold mine, treasure chest, go, dive in. Start looking, because a lot of times you'll find hidden messages, codes, if you will, in the meaning of the names. I'm not going to go through that, what the paragraph comes out to. It's in my book, Archon Invasion. But here's the list of the names that I was referring to, Genesis chapter 10, 6 through 20, specifically the sons of Ham. And if you look at some of these names, like names Terror, Enclosure of Wrath, what would prompt the proud parents of a newborn child to turn to the other and say, Enclosure of wrath. What do you think, honey? I mean, why would you name your kid that? Unless you looked down and said, ah! What is this? Terror! So they named the kid Terror. You know, clearly we know from Scripture that they named their kids for reasons, right? Esau came out red and hairy, so they named him Red and Hairy. That's what Esau means. Jacob's grabbing his heel, so they named him Heel Grabber. That's what Jacob means. So again, you know, there must be some significance to proud parents looking at their kid and naming them some of these things. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're probably thinking, that's absurd. Why the flood? If God's going to wipe out all this stuff, why would he allow Nephilim genetics or corrupted seed, let's say, onto the ark? Well, if he did it this way, I think it was actually a lot more beneficial to mankind than you may think. We end up with the same net result either way. If you believe in multiple incursions, great. Nephilim are after the flood. If you believe in what I'm proposing, great. Nephilim are after the flood. So either way you look at it, because a lot of people are like, I can't wrap my mind around why would God allow that? Well, he had a plan to allow the Nephilim there anyway. Because I could turn to those people and say, well, how in the world, why would God wipe out the whole world, clear off the playing field, leave 4 helpless women there and say, okay, fallen bad guys, there you go, pick up where you left off, have fun. That makes even less sense to me. But either way, we end up with the same net result. Nephilim after the flood. The question is, how did it happen? I believe this is how it happened. If we take the information in the video I just showed you, that it's passed down genetically into the reproductive cells, right? Men have an X and a Y chromosome. Women have 2 X. My proposal is that the 3 wives that got on the ark may have had corrupted genetics as a result of the Joshua 4:18, Jubilee 7:24, Genesis 6:12, corruption of all flesh that took place. And if that's the case, let's imagine a 50-50 hybrid because it's easy for math. She's got 1 bad corrupted, let's say Nephilim chromosome. I'll call it a nephilosome. And a regular one. Well, if they get together with a 100% normal, pure male, i.e. Shem, Ham, or Japheth, then you have a 50-50 chance of having either Nephilim or 100% normal children, based on the odds. What determines the odds? I believe obedience does. What does Scripture say? The sins of the fathers are what? Passed down to how many generations? 4. So how does me doing some kind of sin, let's say I stole this bottle of water, how is that going to pass on to my offspring? There has to be a genetic component, or a spiritual component, I should say, to our genetic DNA, right? How else does my spiritual act of sin pass down genetically to 4 generations? What happens if you're obedient? How many generations? 1,000 generations are blessed. Who of the 3 sons would you say is the most obedient in the text? Shem, of course. 1,000 generations. How many generations from Shem to Yeshua or Jesus? Anybody know?
14.
Less than 1,000, right? Keep it simple. Okay. So I believe that's what determined. The righteousness of the father determined what the outcome would be of the children. Does that make sense? Right off the bat, we see Ham's doing something wrong. Right off the bat. Whatever it is, speculate all you want, but he's doing something wrong. So I believe that's how it's passed down. Whereas, if we go the route of multiple incursions, then you have a 100% tainted, bad, genetic, whatever, fallen angel male getting together with normal women, and it becomes one big, colossal, genetic, huge mess. And you have what I would consider probably people who are not redeemable. The question came up earlier, can Nephilim be redeemed? Who sinned? Adam or Eve? Let me say, who is the sin accounted toward? Adam. They both sinned. But Paul says, by one man, sin entered the world, right? Well, Adam, man, Y chromosome, he got his Y chromosome from God. There's nobody to pass. You can only get the Y chromosome passed down through the Father. So he got his Y chromosome from God. So if we have tainted Y chromosomes out here in the genetic pool, that's a bad deal. But if all of our male genetic Y chromosomes go all the way back to Adam, guess what? We're redeemable by the second Adam, who also got his Y chromosome from his father. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but your theory suggests that even Shem's wife was corrupt.
Yeah, but through obedience on Shem's part.
I heard what you said, but
So in a sense, how many times do we see the righteousness of the man or the father redeems the family? Right?
Well, I'm just wondering, you can continually have, if you had that introduction, you can continually have at various points, you can have corrupted, completely corrupted.
Well, Shem has, let's say, our facsad, right? He's good, let's say he's 100% pure. Well, and he finds a 100% pure woman, problem solved.
There, but I mean, I'm talking about other children.
Well, theoretically, if there, in fact, it's interesting if you compare the timeline, or excuse me, the offspring in the King James versus the Septuagint. The Septuagint records Shem as having, it was either Shem or Arphaxad, I forget which, having a son named Canaan, spelled not Canaan, Canaan. And Jubilees tells you Canaan went out and found some kind of ancient writings of the Watchers, and all it says in Jubilees is he sinned because of it, and he hid it from Noah. Now, we could go on wild speculation on what that was, but we know the Watchers taught men all kinds of bad stuff, right? So it's rather interesting that the King James kind of scrubs him out of the Shem line, but it's there in the Septuagint. Was he Nephilim? I don't think so, but he apparently found something, and if it's true, if it's Shem, I think it's Shem or Arphaxad Canaan, then he's a contemporary with Shem, Cush, Nimrod. They would have been first cousins.
Yeah, I'm just saying is if you have that view, which I'm not married to either one.
Sure.
We have Nephilim after.
Either way.
We have to deal with it.
Right.
But the thing is that just in the genetics, you have homozygous and heterozygous. I mean, you can still have these things produced from the genetic line. Of course, you're saying obedience alters this genetic.
If any man be in
epigenetics,
right, I'm going to cover that. Epigenetics, yes.
Okay.
If any man be in Christ, he is what? All things are what? Are washed away, and all things become. What's all? Become new.
That's the only thing you have. Is the only way it be changed is you have to have recreation. I mean, that's what
A genetic,
that's the only way.
a genetic rewrite. There was a study done, and I wish I could cite the source other than my friend, but a friend of mine who was studying to be a nurse sat in a class, and when she heard my lecture, she goes, "I got to tell you a story." She told me a story about some paper or whatever they were reading, some case study, where they had taken these focus groups of criminals, let's say murderers, thieves, and whatever, adulterers or something, let's say, just for the sake of argument. And they had them in focus groups. The people who had committed the same, what we would call sin, they were calling poor lifestyle decisions, we would call it sin. They found genetically that each of the people in this focus group had a genetic scar, a marker on their DNA in the same location. Different location, same marker for that group, same with this one. Now, I thought, well, I mean, that may explain why a spiritual act of sin gets passed down genetically through the physicality of our DNA. If it in fact puts a marker, an epigenetic marker perhaps, on your DNA, then maybe that's how it's passed down. I would love to see the same focus group study done. Let's say this guy gets saved. Let's test him again. I don't know. It's all speculation at this point. You know, I just find it fascinating.
And your researchers have to have a certain worldview to be looking for this.
Absolutely. I believe Numbers 13:27 through 33 also backs up the no multiple incursions idea when it says that they saw people of great size there, the Canaanites, of course, we saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. So these are Nephilim who came from other Nephilim. Nephilim who came from Nephilim. Dr. Michael Heiser goes into a little bit more detail on that.
We saw the Nephilim, ha-Nephilim there. The Anakites are from the Nephilim. This phrase, from the Nephilim, is min ha-Nephilim. You'll notice there's no yod here. You have the same word spelled two different ways. I think the reason why this is done here is because this is the way it's spelled in Genesis 6. The writer wants to link these Nephilim after the flood with the ones before the flood. And if that's the case, if the Anakim came from, in other words, were related to the Nephilim from before the flood, you don't need the continual cohabitation. You have a genetic relationship intact, so to speak.
I believe he's right on target with that.
We have discovered the secret behind Bluetooth. This video is going to be amazing. First, we're going to get into the last video that I uploaded about Jay-Z and his music video 444, because this ties in to Bluetooth. This also ties in to Vikings, the series that I just finished watching. Watched all 4 seasons of it. Jay-Z just uploaded a music video for his album and song named 444. Now, not only did he upload this, what you're going to hear is he talks about Bluetooth. Listen. This is an excerpt from his music video. We hear the Bluetooth. Now, I do know that Blue Ivy is his daughter's name, but this goes very deep. This is why he's mentioning the tooth. We're going to get into this. Now, what you're looking at here is a film called 444, The Last Day on Earth. It released in 2011, 2012. It's got the same name as Jay-Z's video. And here we see the snake eating its tail. But we also see the blue tooth prominently shown, matching up, overlaying Jay-Z's video. Watch. There's the blue tooth right here. It seems to be highlighted. And in this movie, it's the end of the world. It's the last days on Earth. She's painting this picture of the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is the snake eating its tail. It's time. It's the sine wave. It is sin. Watch.
As though our tradition were again, and
so this goes on. We see many overlays of these people just all spaced out because they know the world's coming, and we see the same voodoo. It's like this voodoo stare in this black woman here. This is from the film again. I call it the voodoo stare. See her eyes? And everyone is spaced out because the world's going to end. This released right around the time of 2012 when all of this end of the world stuff was going on. And here they're laying in the middle of the Ouroboros. And there's time, signifying the time wave, sin, the sine wave, which is the snake. The dust eating dust, that was the curse of the dust. The serpent will go on his dust and eat dust all the days of his life. That brings us back to what we're going to talk about now, and that is Bluetooth. Now this is crazy because Bluetooth was named after Harold Bluetooth, the Viking. Harold Bluetooth, it says right here in the Bluetooth Wikipedia page. I'm not making this up. Now, what's so special about Harold Bluetooth, other than he had a bluish black tooth? This is why they named him Harold Bluetooth. Well, Bluetooth's grandfather was Sigurd, snake in the eye. He had an Ouroboros. He was born with an Ouroboros in his pupil. A snake biting its own tail, which was what we just showed you in this film. And we just showed you how Jay-Z referenced this in his 444 music video. Now, this was prophesied by his mother, Oslog. So we had Harold Bluetooth, which is what Bluetooth was named after. We showed you the Ouroboros, and then his grandfather, Sigurd, snake in the eye, had an Ouroboros in his eye. Now, all of this was depicted in the Vikings on the History Channel, which I just got done watching. They even showed the Ouroboros surrounding Floki. Who is Floki? Well, he was like the Loki character of the Vikings, and he was being punished and they tied him to a pole. And then Ragnar, the king, drew an Ouroboros around Loki. Now it states here that Herald Bluetooth, that the Bluetooth insignia, the sign for the logo for the Bluetooth, which is here, this sign is a rune symbol. That's two rune symbols actually superimposed on one another, the Hagal and the Bajarkan. So I looked those up and look what I found. The Hagal means hail like snow, and the other word, Birkanen, means birch. So this is hail and the birch tree. Now, here are the different instances where it's talked about, and they talk about serpents. Hail is cold grain. They describe it as cold grain coming from heaven. They do talk about Christ in here, but I believe they're trying to mix the good with evil. The birch part of the symbol, they talk about that too. That this birch has no fruit, yet it can generate new life from its leaves. This may be something that has to do with the insemination of the serpent in the human race. Why do you say that, Casey? Because the Bluetooth is a personal area network. Yes, it is a PAN. And here's where the serpent comes in. Because in 2 of the 3 works that James Alefantis produced during his career, before he opened Comet Ping Pong, he shows the serpent, Automatic at Sea, Chapel Perilous. And he talks about the serpent. He talks about the serpent being the cosmic serpent, junk DNA, ping-ponging across the universe, infecting the universe with the blue blood.
Cell organism to the majestic blue whale. Now, in his 1995 breakthrough book, The Cosmic Serpent, Dr. Jeremy Narby, the Swiss archaeologist, comes up with a theory that this junk DNA actually contains a coded language.
And if you still think that Comet Ping Pong and the Pizzagate thing was a psyop, you missed the whole point. You're sadly mistaken. It was there all along. It just never went mainstream because people didn't want this information to become mainstream. A personal area network that reaches 33 feet to 330 feet. Where have we heard that number before? At Pan's Grotto, at the foot of Mount Hermon, where the fallen angels came down at 33 degrees north parallel. And now for the ultimate truth. Just as Moses raised up a serpent in the wilderness for the Israelites, the Son of Man will be raised up on a pole. Those were Jesus' words. This, what you're looking at, is the gelling stone of Harold Bluetooth. Here he depicts Christ. They're saying it's a tree wrapped around him. But on this other side, they admit that this is a serpent wrapped around a lion. On this left side here. Who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah? That would be Christ. Here they call it a tree wrapped around Christ. Here they're saying it's a serpent wrapped around a lion. You do the math and think about Jesus' words of what he said, comparing himself being crucified to the serpent in the wilderness of Moses. Why would Jesus say that? Because Jesus had to come and correct the blue blood by spilling his red, pure blood. Remember, the serpent in the wilderness was bronze, which is 88% copper. Copper makes blue blood. There are organisms on this planet with copper-based blood. Mollusks, spiders, centipedes, and squid. Are you starting to understand what all this really means? And why we need Jesus' purifying blood? Do you get this now? This wasn't some empty sacrifice. This is a sacrifice of all ages. The sacrifice to correct our blood. Being born again. You can't make this up, you guys. The copper IUD is the serpent beast in the womb. This is the story of the copper IUD. The serpent coiled around the T. 1988 is when the copper IUD began being marketed in the United States. And bronze is 88% copper. Let's read the story from the Bible about the womb as you look and see the similarities of the womb and the inner eye. It says they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea. This is the Red Sea. This, in fact, is the womb and also the parting of the Red Sea by Moses. To go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us here out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" This is also the wilderness. Egypt is the pyramid of the image coming into your eye. It is the looking out instead of looking within. This is why the ancient Egyptians built pyramids on the earth. This is the earth here, the convex lens. The Israelites were led out of the wilderness. Through the wilderness for 40 years they were in the wilderness. That represents the 40 weeks in the womb of a human child. And they were led by the ark, which is the earth. The convex lens, this is an ark, the Ark of the Covenant. Moses parted the Red Sea with a staff. That is the Hyloid Canal. He parted the Red Sea with the staff, the power of God. And the twin opposed vortexes, the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day, is what guided them ahead of the ark. And this is it here, the two pillars, the pillar here and the pillar there, connected with the narrow gate to heaven. So they go on complaining. You have brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness. There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food. They are cut off from the waters, the cerebral spinal fluid waters, the endless waters that are self-replenishing, and they must make their way through the vitreous humor waters, which are not self-replenishing. And it says, "Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, 'We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us.' So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, 'Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live.' So Moses made a bronze snake. Bronze is 88% copper. And he put it on the pole. And then anyone who was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived." Now Jesus addresses this in his words, in his own words. He says, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up." And so you see, we have a juxtaposition. We have the blue bloods, the copper-based blood that the Israelites had to look upon to live. And then we had the iron-based pure blood of Christ that corrects our blood, you see. So they were out of Egypt. In the womb, the copper serpent killed them. And that's exactly what the copper IUD does in the womb. Here it is, Paragard, and it is the #1 copper IUD in the world. And when you take this word Paragard and you reverse it, it says drag, A-R-A-P, dragon with, because the word para means with. And so what it really means is with the dragon. So there you have it, you guys. The root word of dragon is drag, as you can see here. Draco, dragon, dragoon, drag. It's all here. Paragard, backwards, is with the dragon. It's coiled like a serpent, self-described right here in their own words. Coiled together, coiled like a serpent. This is it, wrapped around the pole, just as it is in the Bible. Came to market in the United States in 1988. Bronze is 88% copper. It's all there. Mechanism of action, preventing pregnancy. It is the serpent within the womb. Now, we told you that the fallopian tubes represented the serpent eating the dust of the ovaries, the days of its life, the curse placed on it, and that the anatomy of our body tells us the story of the fall of man. When we were given our flesh suits, God wanted to ensure that it was encoded so that one day we could find the truth. Now, this is the man that invented the IUD. His name is Ernest Grafenberg, known to have discovered the G-spot. And more fascinating revelations when we use our own critical thinking to think about the Bible. Now, this is unbelievable, because Cain's Hebrew name, Cayenne, as you can see highlighted in yellow here, is the same word for cyan, which is blue. We talked about the blue bloods, and I've told you that Cain's father is the devil. Now the picture is becoming complete, because Cain, or Cayenne, had the blue blood, just as we told you. And all we're going to do is continue to find these connections, because this is very real. This knowledge has been hidden from you. Now, when we look here, we also see that cyan, its opposite color, its perfectly opposite color, which is called the complementary color, is red. Here you see it. It says here in the 20th century, doctors switched to cyan hospital gowns. Why did they do that? They did it because it is a complementary color of red. You can't make this up. They knew it's a complementary color of red. What does this have to do with Cain, you're asking? Well, Cain spilled his brother's blood. And God goes on, talking about how Cain was now cursed because his brother's blood was crying out all the way to heaven from the ground. Does this ring a bell? Yes, it should, because in the book of Enoch, the cries of all the slain reached heaven as well when the fallen angels came down and mixed with the daughters of men. Again, we have a serpent incursion into the bloodline. So that overlays the story of Cain. And all of that explains why Cyan, in Roman mythology, who was a nymph who tried to prevent Dis from abducting Proserpina, there's your serpent, that when she failed, she dissolved away in tears. Yes, the tears that reached heaven upon the death. And now this all begins to tie together and make sense. Proserpina, the serpent, the daughter of grain and agriculture, and we know that Cain was the tiller of the ground and worker of the fields. And it goes on, it says, and now thou art cursed from the earth, which has opened her mouth to receive your brother's blood from the hand. When you till the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto you their strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth, the opposite of red, cayenne, or cyan. Now, why no one has made these connections up until this point is beyond me. But now we begin to look at the blue bloods. We know that a serpent was raised up in the wilderness by Moses. A blue blood, copper is blue. Copper-based organisms have blue blood. The horseshoe crab. It is called hemocyanin. It is a blue blood component rather than iron-based blood. This is real. And some may argue that some humans also have blue blood. And this is the point I'm putting forward to you. Now, this does not condemn people with blue blood. Obviously, God tries to save Cain. He had a talk with him. He also told people that if you kill Cain, you'll be cursed 7 times. But before Cain killed his brother, God had a talk with him, and he said, if you do well, you shall be accepted. Why would God ask or tell Cain, if you do well, you'll be accepted? Because God already knew that Cain had the blue blood. And he told him, if you do not do well, sin lay at the door, and unto you it will be its desire. In other words, sin will desire you. It will naturally attach to you and rule over you if you allow it. After that, Cain killed his brother. He gave in to his blue blood tendencies, you see. Which is probably why God could not accept Cain's sacrifice, because Cain had different blood. God knew it. And his sacrifice that God made to him was tainted. Now that we use our critical thinking, we can see other connections. Cyanobacteria, the blue bacteria that's taking over the planet. Blue-green algae blooms everywhere. This is part of the curse. And on a side note, Candida, which is a flora type of fungus that grows in different places. Candida is fed by candy or sugar. You see that when you use your own critical thinking, you can get to the bottom of things rather than accepting the general consensus of what is out there. All of this is about words. And I believe we've solved the mystery of Cain, the blue blood, the cyan. Take care and be safe, you guys.